Like a good Christian, 18-year-old Beth Miller always tried to follow the rules in her conservative home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I was raised in church, and I loved learning about the Bible, but my family was very strict. I wasn't allowed to go to dances or parties or anything like that, so I never had any boyfriends.
So in the winter of 2006, when her friends told her about a phone dating service, Beth was curious.
It was like a phone chat line. You would hear a little profile about the person, hear things that they like. I didn't know what I wanted, but I think I was really hoping to find love.
And when Beth connected with the profile of 21-year-old Adam Carrier, she was immediately intrigued.
We both had a passion for music, and that's something that really drew me to him. So we gave each other our phone numbers. I love that.
Before she knew it, the two were talking regularly, and Beth was thrilled to learn they had a ton in common.
He told me that his family was very religious, and they had a lot of the same morals and standards that my family did.
Yeah, my family took it straight and did it.
It was very nice to be able to connect with somebody that kind of understood where I was coming from.
After several weeks of nonstop phone chatter, Beth and Adam were itching to meet in person and set a date for January 15th, 2007.
As soon as I met Adam, all of my butterflies completely disappeared. I don't know if it was love at first sight, but I do think there was a very strong attraction.
The first time we ever met Adam, he seemed likable enough, but it was too soon to tell. I did not want her to rush things, but you can't tell Beth what to do.
We drove to a park and spent some time there and just got to know each other. We really liked each other in person. We just had that connection.
Adam and Beth's dates soon became a regular routine. But when her parents cautioned her to take it slow, Beth, a typical teen, decided to do the opposite.
I spent a lot of time in his apartment, so we decided to move in together pretty quickly. I was in that rebellious stage where I really didn't care what they thought because I loved him and I wanted to be with Adam.
As the two settled in together, Adam worked some short-term jobs to keep them afloat.
I didn't have a driver's license, but Adam was working steady and we were able to make ends meet.
However, Adam revealed that he had loftier career aspirations.
He really loved firefighters. When Adam talked about firefighting, he would be very excited.
I want to be a firefighter so bad.
You could see it in his face that he just loved the whole idea of it.
Beth was proud of her boyfriend and excited about their future. They even got a dog to round out their new family.
I loved having a dog. I would help him take care of it. We enjoyed going for walks and just playing together.
So Beth was surprised one day in April when Adam wanted to walk the dog alone.
I asked him if I could go with him, but he said he wanted to spend some time alone and just get some fresh air. So we argued about it for a few minutes, but I let him go.
Beth's irritation quickly turned to concern when Adam returned hours later.
He said, "Hey, there's a fire across the street. Come look at this. You can see the smoke from here." When we got to this fire, he was very excited.
Beth was surprised as Adam jumped out of the car and tried to help the firefighters.
I just didn't understand why he was so passionate about it. But I really thought that he genuinely wanted to help other people.
But helping others was the last thing on Adam's mind. He had something much more sinister planned.
He was hiding this other side of him.
No one had any idea what Adam was doing.
It was a shock. I didn't think he would ever take it that far.
In the spring of 2007, Beth Miller was playing house with her new boyfriend, Adam Carrier.
I loved living with Adam. I had never met anybody in my life that I connected with the way that I did with him.
While life in the love nest was peaceful, Beth couldn't ignore her parents' disdain.
Beth was raised in a Christian home, but in our way of thinking, living together outside the bonds of marriage is a sin against God.
So to us, the only option was to get married. I didn't feel like I would ever find anyone else like him.
So after 5 months together, Beth couldn't have been happier as she walked down the aisle toward her true love.
We got married at the church that I grew up in, and my mother made my wedding dress. You could just really see that Adam was happy.
I was very shocked that she was getting married because it was sudden, but they definitely looked very, very happy and just excited.
But just a few months after the wedding, Beth was learning that real marriages had their challenges.
Adam had trouble keeping a job, and we weren't able to pay the bills or make ends meet, and it was very stressful, and it made it hard for us to get along.
Get off my back, okay?
Although there was one job that still excited Adam.
He never lost the dream of wanting to be a firefighter. If we were driving down the road and he would see a fire truck, he would just stop whatever we were doing and turn around and follow it.
With Beth's encouragement, Adam decided to apply at a local volunteer fire department. But when he learned about the extensive testing the job required, his enthusiasm waned.
Adam had a lot of trouble when he was in school, and I think maybe he was nervous. He didn't think that he would pass.
Still, the couple's main priority was paid employment in any form. So in the spring of 2008, Beth was relieved when Adam said he'd found a job at a farm equipment store.
I decided to surprise him, so I called my mother up and asked her to bring me by his work so that I could bring him some lunch. And I went inside and I asked for Adam. A manager came out and they told me he didn't work there. And said that no one had even applied there by that name. I was very embarrassed. My first thought automatically was he was doing something he shouldn't be doing. I thought maybe he was cheating.
That evening, Beth confronted Adam.
He came home like it was a regular work day.
Where were you today? I must have been at lunch. I don't know.
I let him know that I knew he hadn't been at work.
You were not there. Listen, I think you're blowing this way out of proportion.
He implied that he had just lost the job, so I let the subject go. I felt like, based on the way we were raised, we should be doing everything that we can to make our marriage work.
So for the next year, Beth kept her head down as Adam continued to work odd jobs.
Something would happen and he would quit or he would get fired. Every time he blamed it on someone else. Nothing was ever his fault.
And in April 2009, Beth couldn't take it anymore. With only one car between them and no driver's license, she landed the only job she could within walking distance.
I was just waiting tables in a pizza place, but it was a lot better financially, and we were able to take care of ourselves better.
Beth hoped their marriage would soon get back on track. But that hope would be short-lived when Beth discovered a fiery side to her husband that she never saw coming.
It never entered my mind that he could be capable of doing that.
Adam was like two different people.
I never dreamed that Adam could be capable of this kind of violence.
In the spring of 2009, Beth Carrier was working hard to repair her marriage after catching her husband in a lie.
Been at lunch. I don't know.
We're not there. Knowing that he lied to me about something important, like a job, That made me question everything else. It made me wonder if he had lied to me about other more important things.
To avoid fighting, Beth threw herself into her new job. But one day that summer, she noticed her husband was blowing off steam in an entirely different way.
Adam liked to burn things in a barrel. He wasn't like setting a fire on the ground or anything like that. They were always contained. He would just burn trash or leaves, anything that he could find.
It seemed that the only thing that hadn't changed about Adam was his desire to become a firefighter.
He bought a police scanner and he would just listen to it so that he would know when there were fires. I felt like it was just a toy. And if he had this passion, then he should be doing anything that he could to achieve that dream. But he wasn't really trying to pursue it.
Despite the trust she was losing in him, Beth wasn't prepared to call it quits just yet. Until one night in September of 2009, when everything changed.
I wasn't happy with things that he was doing in his life. I was trying to talk to him and he didn't want to listen to me, and that made me angry. I had a drink in my hand and I threw the drink down on the ground and he became extremely enraged.
Really?
And I was very afraid. I knew then that I had to do whatever I could to get his hands off of me. So I dug my fingernails into his arm, and the second he let go, I ran and grabbed the phone to call 911. He grabbed a knife and cut the cord on the phone. Part of me believed that he didn't want to hurt me, but at the same time, I was terrified.
Suddenly, Adam took off.
I walked over to my parents' house. They knew right away that something was wrong. My mom proceeded to call the police, and they came and filed a report. It was overwhelming because I didn't think that things would ever escalate this far.
Luckily, Beth's physical injuries were minor, except for her broken heart.
Whilst her marriage was ending, she was very sad. It definitely tried, it just didn't work out. He wasn't her Prince Charming.
Over the next year, Beth tried to put her life with Adam behind her, even getting her driver's license and buying her first car. But in January of 2010, Adam found a way to creep back in.
I was at work, and one of my friends texted me, and she had been watching the news and saw his name. She sent me a link to the news channel's page.
Beth casually clicked on the link, and what she saw next would send her mind reeling. In January 2010, Beth Carrier was blindsided when she read a news article her friend texted her and saw her former husband Adam pictured in a mugshot.
I read it and found out that he had been arrested for arson. I was completely surprised. It was just very overwhelming and my mind was scattered.
Beth had no idea that just 2 weeks before, Adam had joined the West Feliciana Volunteer Fire Department as a probationary firefighter. And on January 15th, 2010, the fire department was called to extinguish 2 suspicious fires at abandoned buildings.
Both residences did not have running electricity to them, so somebody lit that fire. There was really no ignition source for a fire to start. They knew it was an arson.
And fire investigators had begun looking into a suspect, their new hire.
Adam was seen that night driving the fire truck prior to the fires being called in. almost pacing up and down the road in a fire truck like he was waiting for something. So that raised some eyebrows.
Though investigators didn't find anything in Adam's record, they uncovered more evidence that pointed right to him and brought the young fireman in for questioning.
We matched Adam's boots to the footprints that were found outside one of the buildings. His tire tracks matched the tire tracks found at the second residence. I think all this stacked together made Adam realize that he was in a no-way-out situation. That's when Adam confessed to setting the fires.
Adam admitted starting a fire at the first location and waiting for the call to come in.
I got in the fire truck and I went to an abandoned bar and I looked through the windows and I lit them on fire.
When the call didn't come in initially, he thought the fire just did not start, so he went to a second location, found an abandoned house that he lit on fire.
But when the call finally came in for the first fire, Adam responded to the second.
This raised some suspicion on what was going on because nobody else had any knowledge of a fire being over there.
Guys, where are you? I'm already at the location.
Adam told investigators he set the fires in order to bring attention to hardworking volunteer firefighters.
It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Not only are you damaging someone's property, but you're also putting your other firefighters at risk.
Suddenly, Adam mentioned a few other fires.
It really got the interest of the fire marshal's investigator, and it made us question how long had he been doing this.
Adam ultimately confessed to setting 8 additional fires in the surrounding areas over the last 3 years.
I was shocked to learn that one of our volunteer firefighters was a serial arsonist. A serial arsonist could have any one of a few motives. Maybe it's to cover up a crime, maybe it's for insurance, or they just like to watch things burn and like the power it gives them. I believe he had some self-esteem issues. He needed the pat on the back. And they refer to it the hero complex. Nobody knows they start the fire, but everybody will know that they're the ones that put it out and save the day.
The next day, the fire chief contacted Beth, and she was floored to learn Adam had been setting fires during their entire marriage.
That's when I realized that all of these fires that he took me to, he set. The day that he took the dog for a walk and wouldn't let me come. He was so excited when he wanted to show me this fire. Now I realize that he was bragging.
On January 28, 2010, Adam Carrier was charged with 10 counts of arson. Though no one had been injured, Adam caused over $300,000 in damages, and all signs seemed to point towards an escalation.
I think if Adam would have been able to continue, there's really no telling how it would have ended up. It may have resulted in injury for someone in a home or a firefighter.
On April 28, 2011, Adam Carrier accepted a plea deal, copping to just 2 of the 10 fires, both in West Feliciana. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison.
I think Adam is wounded and he's damaged, but I know that at some time he had good intentions. He just got lost.
Today, Beth's journey into adulthood is complete.
I still work for the same company. I've moved up and into a management position, so I feel like I've achieved a lot more on my own than I ever could have achieved without him.
Beth definitely changed because of this experience. She's more independent. She has her life together now.
I'm at a place in my life where I'm comfortable being alone. And if I don't find someone else that I trust and I love, I'll be okay because I can take care of myself now.
In the fall of 2006, 25-year-old single mom Katie Cole was seeking her footing in the adult world.
My previous relationship just didn't work out, so I was taking business administration classes and raising my daughter. It was stressful being a single mom, but I had family and friends helping out a lot.
A A Staten Island cop's daughter, Katie hadn't found the right career or Mr. Right yet. But the red-haired beauty did know one thing.
I was open to finding love, finding someone to help me, raise this baby up and take part in her life.
Unfortunately, no one really stood out to Katie. Until that September while at a party, when she met a friend of a friend, Anthony Greco.
At the end of the night, I was sitting in my car and he was throwing acorns at my car to get my attention, I guess. I said to my friend, I was like, is your friend an idiot? Why is he throwing things at my car? And she said,
that's just my friend Anthony.
I guess he didn't know what to say, and that was his way of being like, hey, notice me.
And Katie couldn't help but notice how attractive the 27-year-old was.
Anthony, he was handsome.
I'm Anthony.
Katie.
On the outside, he was very rough and rugged. And I guess that's one of my faults. I always went for the bad boy.
So a few weeks later, Katie invited Anthony over for dinner. And was glad she did.
We talked about a lot of things.
So tell me about your daughter.
She's beautiful.
He did mention he wanted kids one day.
Really?
I really can't wait to have my own.
He was a foreman. His future goals were to open his own contracting company. I found Anthony's ambition and his drive to be attractive.
Over the next few weeks, Anthony began spending more and more time at Katie's house.
The relationship progressed really, really fast. Faster than I or anyone could have imagined it would. He was fantastic with my daughter. Being a single mom, it's a package deal, and a lot of guys can't handle that, and Anthony seemed to be more than happy with it.
When Katie met Anthony, he sounded like the perfect guy. He wanted to be involved with her and with her daughter. He sounded like he was able to provide her with everything that she had wanted and hoped for.
So just 2 months later, Katie and her daughter found themselves moving into Anthony's beautiful home.
He was like, the house is big enough for us, big enough for your daughter. It was moving fast, but it was moving in the right direction.
But she had no sooner moved in when drama came knocking on her new front door.
We're sitting on the couch, and it's late. Anthony said,
Oh my God, it's my ex-girlfriend.
I was like, wait, what? He said, let me go handle this. I hear her screaming, saying, you gave her the life that I was supposed to have.
I'm supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be living here with you. This shouldn't be her right now. This should be us.
I was like shocked. He's like, I'm in love with this girl, and I want to spend the rest of my life with this girl. And then she's like, all right, I'm just glad you guys are happy.
I
And
hope you guys have a wonderful life together.
she ends up leaving.
Anthony explained the incident by telling Katie that his ex-girlfriend Melissa had never accepted their breakup.
So that was the end of it. I let it go. Anthony seemed to be someone that I could have a future with.
So that Christmas Eve, Katie was thrilled when Anthony popped the question.
I was a little surprised that he had proposed so soon, but I was happy that my granddaughter had a father figure in her life.
2 months later, Katie and Anthony said their vows in an intimate ceremony at a gorgeous lakeside club.
It was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. I kind of felt like, wow, I can't believe I'm actually getting the fairy tale ending.
But it wouldn't take long for Katie's fairy tale to turn into a nightmare when her husband hatched a sinister plot that would destroy her family forever.
I never saw this coming.
The lengths he went to were unbelievable.
I started crying and screaming, just tell me the truth.
In February of 2007, newlyweds Katie and Anthony Greco were raising her daughter and anxious to start a family of their own.
I felt like no matter what happens now, we're starting our life and it's official.
As one of her new wifely duties, Katie decided to take over the finances and soon discovered something odd.
Anthony did not know how to pay his bills. He didn't have a bank account. The money was not enough to cover all of the bills. I mean, the mortgage was out of control high.
But Anthony reassured his bride.
Don't worry.
He told Katie he recently filed a lawsuit against the builder of his house and was expecting $1 million payday.
We get about $1 million.
A lawsuit.
Anthony was confident that the money from the lawsuit would solve all the problems financially that we were having.
Trust me, I'd rob a bank for this family if I had to.
And I'm like, all right, okay.
So when Katie learned she was pregnant that May, she had every expectation that Anthony would be a provider for their family.
He always said, I want to make sure that my kids have everything I didn't have when I was growing up, and they never know the struggles that I knew.
But 4 months into her pregnancy, her husband was still struggling to make ends meet. So the two felt they had no choice but to foreclose on the house and move in with Katie's parents.
I was very excited when they moved home. I wanted them to be secure. I didn't want them to worry. A lot of people, small house, but we made it work.
Once their son was born in February 2008, Katie's hopes were bolstered by Anthony's ability as a loving father. Still, money was tight, so when Anthony suggested they move to Florida, where he was raised, Katie thought the move might be just what they needed.
He thought that it would be easier to get a job out there. It's a good place to raise kids, and I thought it would be ideal, that maybe we needed a fresh start.
So that spring, Anthony's family helped the couple rent an apartment in Tampa, and Anthony accepted a low-paying job as a security guard.
I think Anthony wanted to be the breadwinner and provider, but the money was still not enough to cover all of the bills. He kept thinking that this lawsuit's gonna come and save the day. And I found out I was pregnant again. At first, I was just scared. He still wasn't able to support us, and I'm home with 2 kids. It was a sticky situation.
To add to her frustration, Katie couldn't help but notice something different about her husband in Florida.
He became more secretive. He began taking long walks at night without me. He was changed. One morning, the kids were still sleeping. Anthony decided he's gonna go to the gym, and he left his phone on the table. So I looked through his phone, and I found a phone number that wasn't saved for a New York cell phone.
Katie was shaken when she recognized the voice that answered as Melissa.
I was shocked. I was like, are you kidding me? This is unbelievable. She said that he was telling her, I always loved you, I always wanted to be with you. The only reason I'm with her now is because I have children with her. And I'm like, oh my God, this is not happening right now.
Katie confronted Anthony the moment he stepped foot in the door.
I saw the number on the phone. Yeah, I talked to her.
Katie, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. She's been calling me.
I knew he was lying, but I had nobody in Florida, and I was isolated from everything. I was desperate to come home, be back in Staten Island. I told him, you're either with me or you're not, and he decided that he would rather have his family. So I gave him another chance.
So that winter, the Grecos all moved back to New York and into Katie's parents' home again. But not even the comforts of home could save Katie when her husband's strange behavior reached a whole new level.
I felt like I couldn't protect her or the grandkids.
He was really going off the deep end.
I was devastated. I never thought I would land in such a nightmare.
By the winter of 2008, after giving birth to their second child, Katie Greco and her husband Anthony had come full circle.
It was mixed emotions being back at my parents' house. I was glad because I knew we were okay and we were safe, but I felt defeated because we didn't make it in Florida.
So in November 2010, when Katie's grandfather died, the pair chose to move 85 miles away to Coopersburg, Pennsylvania.
I wanted to be closer to my grandmother. And it was more cost-effective to be up there. And the icing on the cake would be that we're not where the ex-girlfriend is.
Life seemed a little more stable for the couple. But the very next month, Katie was astounded to learn she was pregnant yet again.
I was scared to death. I mean, granted, we were grounded and things were okay for the moment, but I knew with this last baby that we were always going to struggle.
Adding to the pressure, Anthony found out that the big payday he had been expecting wasn't coming.
When Anthony found out that the lawsuit was finally going to be settled for way less than he initially planned for, he was livid. Anthony definitely spiraled out of control. He became angry, irrational. He would fight with me over a fork being in the spoon's drawer, like nonsense.
It's just a fork.
You could tell that Katie was under a lot of stress. They had 3 kids. She was pregnant with the 4th. And she just wanted to come home.
I didn't want my kids to think that this was a normal, healthy relationship. So I decided to move back to Staten Island because his anger was out of control. Anthony tried everything in his power to get me to stay, but I was done.
So in October 2012, Katie moved back home and gave birth to their 3rd child. She and Anthony were amicable and agreed to put off their custody hearing until the divorce was final.
We decided that he would take them every other weekend down to Pennsylvania. So that was fine by me. He would come get them on a Friday and return them on Sunday. They would go have a good time, come home, no problem.
But one weekend, Katie couldn't help but notice Anthony came to get the kids in a brand new car.
I walk out of the house and I'm looking for the minivan that he was driving. And he said, no, I'm driving this blue Cadillac. And I said, well, whose car is this? And he goes, oh, it's a relative of his, whatever.
And that wasn't the only change in her ex.
He looked like he got hit by a Mack truck. Forget 5 o'clock shadow. He had like 24-hour shadow.
Terrible.
Yeah, I know. I've been working late.
Something was definitely not right, but who am I to say, like, you don't look right, you're not taking the kids, you know? I just kind of like noted it.
The next evening, Katie called to say goodnight to her children as usual.
He picked up the phone, sounded normal at first, no problem. All of a sudden he says, I have to let you know there was an issue here. The cops were here.
What do you mean the cops were there?
And then he said, there was a robbery in the area.
Oh my God.
The person tried to get into our house. He's like, don't worry, nothing's wrong. He really didn't get into specifics, and I thought it was over at that point.
But the following morning, when Katie received a phone call from a detective, she discovered it was far from over.
They were very scared. They felt like they were going to die that day.
I was freaking out. I knew I had to get my kids away from him.
On November 12, 2012, Katie Greco received an early morning wake-up call from a detective in Quakertown, Pennsylvania.
I pick up the phone, and the man on the other end says, this is Detective so-and-so, and he proceeds to tell me that there was a bank robbery.
Robbery?
The bank robbery occurred November 8, 2012 at the TD Bank, which is in Quakertown. The man comes into the bank wearing this ridiculous ZZ Top beard. He has a gun. He gets the money, runs out the door.
Luckily, no one was hurt, and the robber only netted about $650.
He said the person fled in a vehicle, and the vehicle was found on the property that was leased to me and my husband.
When the detective told Katie the make of the vehicle, she sat in utter shock.
What kind of car did you say it was?
He said it was a dark-colored Cadillac. Does that ring a bell? Now I'm reflecting on all the events of that weekend. The crazy look in his eyes, the way he sounded when I spoke to him on Saturday. I just initially felt like I couldn't be honest. I was like, no, I don't know of a blue Cadillac.
Katie could only think about one thing.
I text Anthony. I'm freaking out, and I just could not have my kids home soon enough.
Once the children were home safely, Katie barraged Anthony with questions.
When Anthony dropped the children off, I made sure they were in the house, they were out of earshot. And I told him that the detective called. I said, I know you were driving that car. What's going on? And he's like,
it's not my car, okay? It wasn't me. I had nothing to do with it.
He assured me that everything was fine, but I knew something wasn't right.
Whatever. I'm gonna go see the kids.
I thought about him joking about robbing a bank.
Trust me, rob a bank is bad.
Like, who jokes about that?
Katie was determined to get to the bottom of it. And a few weeks later, she got her chance.
He had come over, and he was having a visit with the kids, and the kids had gone to bed, and we started drinking wine. And I said,
Look, I know what you did. You need to tell me the truth.
I deserve to know the truth. You had my kids up there. I trusted you, and I want to know now. And he said,
It didn't go as planned.
You actually robbed a bank?
Katie listened in horror as the father of her children confessed to hatching a plan to rob the bank with a man named Joe Scala.
Anthony Greco and Joe Scala were longtime friends. Joseph Scala had a drug problem, and he would pretty much do anything. Anthony got his gullible friend to go along with it to get some money for drugs. But Anthony Greco was the mastermind of this crime.
He's like, I was supposed to pump gas. Joe was supposed to go into the bank, do it, take off, and then if the police were following him, I was to cut the police off, causing a crash and a diversion so he could get out of, the area. I was outraged because this meant he brought my kids up there, knowing damn well what he did. So I called the lieutenant and I said, you wanted to know if I heard anything else? And I said, well, I'm telling you what he told me. Me letting them know that he confessed to me was just icing on the cake. They had all kinds of evidence.
Cops were able to look inside the car. They saw gloves, they saw the bag, they saw all the stuff from the bank robbery.
Detectives matched the license plate from the Cadillac to Anthony Greco and the DNA from the items found in the car to Joe Scala. 4 months after the robbery, police arrested them both.
I was happy when Anthony was arrested, but I also knew that this was going to put a lot of stress on Katie. And to watch my friend go through all that was very painful.
On November 12, 2013, Anthony Greco pled guilty to 22 charges, including robbery, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. His partner in crime, Joe Scala, pled guilty to the same charges and was sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison due to the enhanced nature of his crimes.
Anthony Greco told the judge that at the time of the bank robbery, he had 4 kids, his wife was leaving him, and he thought if he had more money, she would stay.
It was just an excuse. He was so angry and so bitter over not getting this lawsuit money that he felt was his. I think his greed got the better of him.
Today, Katie is still dealing with the aftermath of her husband's crimes.
It hurt to have to tell my kids. I can handle a lot, but to look at your kids and have to explain things, big people problems to little people, they don't get it. If Katie ever decided to settle down again, that person would have their work cut out for them to prove themselves to be trustworthy.
But Katie still hopes that one day Anthony will have a renewed bond with his children.
As angry as I am with him, he's still their dad. And I hope that this experience will let him realize that there's more to life than your own selfishness, and your decisions affect everyone around you.
There is a profound and terrifying difference between a crime born of sudden, blinding rage, and a tragedy that is meticulously architected in the cold, quiet corners of a predatory mind. When a life is taken in the heat of the moment, the aftermath is usually a chaotic scattering of evidence, driven by panic, confusion, and instantaneous regret. The perpetrator leaves behind a messy trail that investigators can easily follow. However, when a murder is designed by someone who views themselves as intellectually superior, someone who lacks fundamental human empathy, the crime scene becomes a carefully constructed stage. The perpetrator acts as the ultimate director, meticulously placing the props, choreographing the final moments of the unsuspecting victim, and anticipating the exact reactions of the audience, which, in this grim scenario, are the local authorities. This is the chilling reality of what transpired in the quiet American Midwest during the summer of 1980, a case that would eventually span thousands of miles, cross entire oceans, and deeply test the absolute limits of forensic science and federal determination. It is a story about the devastating illusion of safety, the terrifying duality of human nature, and the extensive lengths to which a guilty man will go to bury his monstrous past beneath the shifting sands of a distant, isolated tropical paradise. The geographical trajectory of this tragedy is as staggering as the brutal crime itself. It is a narrative that begins in the quiet, pastoral landscapes of the American mainland and concludes on a remote, sun-drenched island in the deep waters of the South Pacific. It is a journey from the rolling hills and serene horse farms of Hillsdale County, Michigan, to the absolute isolation of American Samoa. To even begin to understand the sheer scale of this evasion, one must first look closely at the mind of the man who orchestrated it. David Davis was not your typical criminal, nor was he a man driven to violence by desperate societal circumstances or sudden financial ruin. He was a commercial pilot, a profession that inherently commands immediate respect, demands a high level of continuous education, and requires an exceptional degree of unshakable composure under immense pressure. Pilots are specifically trained to navigate through severe turbulence, to rely heavily on complex instrumentation, and to make rapid, calculated decisions when hundreds of lives are on the line. They are, by definition, individuals who operate above the rest of the world, looking down at the earth from a vantage point of supreme control and absolute detachment. But beneath the neatly pressed uniform and the calm, authoritative demeanor of the seasoned aviator, David Davis harbored a deeply unstable and profoundly controlling psychological landscape. The very traits that made him a highly capable pilot, his intense obsession with details, his unwavering need for absolute control, and his clinical, unemotional detachment, mutated into something unspeakably dark within the intimate confines of his personal life. He was a man who required total dominion over his domestic environment and the people existing within it. When an individual with such an intense, pathological need for control decides that a human life is merely an obstacle to his personal desires, the resulting actions are terrifyingly precise. He did not view his fatal actions through the lens of traditional morality, but rather as a complex logistical problem requiring a permanent clinical solution. He possessed the immense arrogance of a man who firmly believed his superior intellect could easily outmaneuver the standard mechanisms of justice, a toxic belief that would eventually fuel one of the most audacious disappearing acts in modern criminal history. At the tragic center of this impending darkness was Shannon Davis, a woman whose life was violently extinguished at the exact moment she believed it was beginning anew. At just 36 years old, Shannon was enthusiastically stepping into what should have been a beautiful chapter defined by stability, romantic partnership, and domestic joy. She was a newlywed, having been married to David for only a brief matter of months. The early days of a new marriage are traditionally a period of profound optimism, a sacred time dedicated to building a shared future and finding absolute comfort in the constant presence of a chosen life partner. For Shannon, this period of hopeful anticipation was a cruel, manufactured illusion, a carefully constructed facade maintained flawlessly by the man she had completely trusted with her life. It is entirely devastating to contemplate the inherent vulnerability of a newlywed, the absolute, unconditional trust placed in a spouse, and the total, horrifying unawareness that the person sleeping peacefully beside you is quietly calculating the exact methodology of your demise. Shannon was not just a victim of a physical murder, she was the victim of an incomprehensible emotional betrayal. Her presence in David's life was, to his calculating mind, merely a temporary arrangement, a necessary stepping stone to a massive financial windfall that he valued far more than her humanity or her future. The flawless execution of a sinister plan took place on July 23, 1980, in the jurisdiction of Hillsdale, Michigan. Hillsdale, with its expansive rural beauty and quiet, close-knit local communities, was the absolute antithesis of a theater for a brutal, premeditated homicide. It was a peaceful place heavily characterized by its traditional agricultural heritage, where the steady rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons and the vast stretches of land. It was exactly here, amidst the deceptive, idyllic tranquility of a local horse farm, that David Davis decided to finally spring his lethal trap. The specific location was absolutely not chosen by accident or convenience. A sprawling farm naturally offers vast isolation, and the constant presence of large, incredibly powerful animals provides the perfect, unquestionable raw material for fabricating a believable tragedy. The weapon David meticulously chose to end his wife's life was not a loud firearm, a bloody blade, or any conventional instrument of physical violence that would immediately raise the red flags of a standard medical examiner. Instead, he utilized his extensive education and his privileged access to sophisticated information to select a weapon that was functionally invisible to the naked eye. He deliberately chose succinylcholine, a highly powerful, incredibly fast-acting synthetic muscle relaxant typically utilized in controlled medical settings to induce temporary muscular paralysis, usually preceding routine intubation during complex surgical procedures. In the medical and forensic landscape of 1980, succinylcholine was considered the absolute holy grail of poisons for a calculating, intelligent killer. It was incredibly difficult to reliably detect in the routine, standard autopsies of that specific era, as the chemical rapidly breaks down within the human body, leaving almost little to no obvious, glaring toxicological signature behind for standard pathologists to find. The physiological and deep psychological horror inflicted by the malicious use of succinylcholine cannot possibly be overstated. When intentionally injected into a healthy human system, the potent drug rapidly and aggressively blocks the transmission of critical nerve impulses to the skeletal muscles, causing an immediate, total, and inescapable physical paralysis. Crucially, and most horrifyingly, however, this specific chemical agent does absolutely nothing to affect the central nervous system's fundamental capacity for active consciousness or acute sensory perception. The helpless victim remains entirely awake, completely and vividly aware of their immediate surroundings, and fully capable of experiencing unimaginable terror, yet they are physically frozen in place. They cannot physically speak to beg for mercy. They cannot move their limbs to struggle against their attacker. And most terrifyingly of all, they cannot naturally breathe as the heavy, unyielding paralysis quickly and efficiently overtakes the autonomic respiratory system. The dark, suffocating realization of exactly what was happening to Shannon Davis in those final, agonizingly silent moments is a depth of human suffering almost too profound to properly articulate. She was permanently trapped inside the failing prison of her own paralyzed body, forced by chemical restraint to passively watch the very man she had joyfully married just months prior actively orchestrate her slow, silent asphyxiation. It was a brutal death defined by absolute silent agony and profound physical helplessness, an incredibly clinical execution, seamlessly masquerading as an unpredictable medical anomaly. Once the drug had fully taken its intended course, and Shannon had tragically stopped breathing forever, David's meticulous, cold-blooded choreography seamlessly continued into its next crucial phase. The quiet murder itself was only the first essential phase of his grand objective. The second, equally important phase was the theatrical performance meant for the authorities. He physically transported her lifeless, unresisting body to a specific dirt area located within the expansive grounds of the horse farm, carefully positioning her resting form directly on the rough ground. He then proceeded to deliberately and forcefully inflict severe blunt force trauma upon her deceased remains, systematically creating deep, ugly bruises and massive contusions across her flesh. This horrific act was the final, macabre finishing touch to his elaborate master plan. He was framing an innocent animal for his own unspeakable atrocity. He fully intended to present a cohesive narrative that was undeniably tragic but entirely logically plausible within a rural, agricultural setting. According to his carefully rehearsed script, his beloved wife Shannon had tragically suffered a horrific, fatal accident while leisurely horseback riding, having been violently and repeatedly kicked or severely trampled by a suddenly startled, massive horse. It was a brilliant, manipulative narrative specifically designed by a predator to immediately evoke deep communal sympathy rather than sharp police suspicion, effectively shifting all potential blame away from the grieving, shocked husband and placing it squarely on the inherently unpredictable, dangerous nature of a large, heavy beast. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the staged discovery, it genuinely appeared to everyone involved that the brilliant pilot David Davis had successfully executed the mythical perfect crime. The local county police officers, earnestly operating completely without the distinct benefit of advanced toxicological foresight or highly specialized forensic investigative units, quickly surveyed the bloody scene and readily accepted the heartbreaking narrative that was smoothly presented to them by the sobbing widower. To the standard untrained eye of the public, or even to a standard, hardworking law enforcement officer of that specific era, the visible physical evidence, perfectly scattered at the dusty farm, aligned absolutely perfectly with the plausible story of a tragic, unforeseen equestrian accident. The severe bruises covering her body were entirely consistent with a massive, heavy impact from a hoof, and there were absolutely no obvious, glaring signs of a human struggle, defensive wounds, or overt foul play that would immediately and undeniably trigger a full-scale, suspicious homicide investigation. The initial, official conclusion drawn by the local authorities was one of profound, terrible misfortune. Shannon Davis's untimely death was officially, legally documented as a purely tragic accident, a terrible, unpredictable twist of cruel fate that had violently claimed the life of a vibrant, happy young woman in the absolute prime of her existence. Behind the heavily closed doors of his home, David Davis flawlessly played the sympathetic role of the utterly devastated, heartbroken widower to absolute perfection, while simultaneously and aggressively moving behind the scenes to quickly collect the massive, lucrative life insurance policy he had recently secured on the life of his new wife. The resulting financial payout was incredibly substantial, a staggering monetary reward for his sociopathic patience, his clinical brutality, and his flawless acting. He had successfully, entirely manipulated the local legal and investigative systems, coldly converting a beautiful human life into a stack of cold, untraceable currency. He genuinely believed in his own absolute invincibility, feeling entirely secure in the arrogant knowledge that his chosen methodology was far too scientifically sophisticated for the simple local authorities to ever begin to unravel. He possessed the vast sum of money he desired, he retained his absolute personal freedom, and he remained completely and utterly detached from any lingering sense of moral consequence or human guilt. However, the perceived perfection of any meticulously planned crime is almost always a fragile illusion, one that eventually shatters under the immense, unyielding weight of human intuition and the relentless, unstoppable passage of time. While the local police department had confidently closed their investigative files and moved on, the grieving family of Shannon Davis continuously harbored a deep, entirely unsettling conviction that the neat, tidy narrative of the tragic horse accident was fundamentally, terribly flawed. Their profound, agonizing grief was constantly compounded by an undeniable, persistent, intuitive sense of wrongness. They deeply knew Shannon, they knew the somewhat rushed circumstances of her hasty, sudden marriage, and they intuitively recognized the chilling coldness hidden deep within David's eyes that absolutely no amount of loudly feigned mourning could ever completely obscure from those who truly paid attention. Their absolute, stubborn refusal to blindly accept the official, convenient conclusion, heavily fueled by the highly suspicious timing of the death and the incredibly massive insurance payout that quickly followed, would soon become the unstoppable catalyst for an unprecedented, massive pursuit. This steadfast, unyielding familial love and relentless quest for ultimate truth would soon violently ignite the intense interest of high-level federal investigators, permanently pulling the massive resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation into this complex, dark web of lethal deceit. It would ultimately prompt a radical, groundbreaking re-examination of the ignored physical evidence, leading directly to the grim exhumation of Shannon's resting remains and the unprecedented deployment of advanced, pioneering forensic technologies that the arrogant pilot David Davis could never have possibly anticipated in 1980. And when the invisible walls of his carefully constructed, murderous reality finally began to rapidly close in around him, the incredibly arrogant, highly intelligent aviator would absolutely not stay to face the severe legal consequences of his monstrous actions. Instead, he would fully leverage his unique professional skills, his sharp intellect, and his ultimate, terrifying lack of attachment to anything other than his own continued survival, to simply and completely vanish from the face of the earth. He would embark on a desperate, sprawling, multi-year flight across the vast North American continent, disappearing through the freezing, unforgiving expanses of the Alaskan wilderness, and ultimately flying far across the immense, blue vastness of the Pacific Ocean. He would completely shed his former identity, burying the name David Davis forever and resurrecting himself on a remote, sun-baked, culturally distinct island where he foolishly believed his horrific past could never possibly reach him. This is a profound, terrifying story of a ruthless predator who desperately sought permanent refuge at the absolute edge of the world, meticulously building a pristine, universally respected new life upon a hidden foundation of absolute horror, utterly and blissfully unaware that the incredibly long, patient, and unforgiving arm of true justice was slowly, methodically reaching across the vast ocean to finally drag him back into the light. To truly comprehend the profound tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 1980, one must first step back from the clinical details of the crime scene and immerse oneself in the environment where the seeds of this dark deception were so meticulously sown. The geographical and temporal setting of a crime often acts as a silent participant, shaping the behaviors of both the predator and the prey. Hillsdale County, located in the south-central region of Michigan, was the very embodiment of the idyllic American Midwest during the dawn of a new decade. As the chaotic and culturally turbulent era of the 1970s slowly gave way to the 1980s, places like Hillsdale remained deeply anchored in tradition, stability, and a profound sense of communal trust. This was a sprawling landscape defined by endless stretches of fertile agricultural land, quiet country roads lined with ancient oak trees, and expansive horse farms that operated on the slow, predictable rhythms of the changing seasons. It was a place where neighbors genuinely knew one another, where the concept of locking front doors was often considered an unnecessary precaution, and where the most significant local news usually revolved around harvest yields or community gatherings. In such an environment, the sheer concept of a highly calculated, chemically induced domestic homicide was not merely uncommon, it was entirely alien, existing far beyond the imaginative boundaries of the local law enforcement and the residents alike. It was precisely this pervasive atmosphere of pastoral innocence and inherent trust that provided the perfect, unblemished canvas for a mastermind of manipulation. At the very heart of this impending darkness was Shannon Davis, a woman whose vibrant life and inherent goodness stand in stark, devastating contrast to the cold brutality of her eventual demise. At 36 years old, Shannon was navigating a pivotal chapter in her life, a period often characterized by a deep, introspective desire for permanent stability and enduring companionship. She was a woman who radiated a quiet, steady warmth, possessing a naturally trusting disposition that drew people toward her. Those who knew Shannon best described her as someone with an immense capacity for empathy, an individual who consistently looked for the absolute best in everyone she encountered. This fundamental optimism, this unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of others, was undoubtedly her most beautiful quality, yet, in a brutally tragic twist of fate, it would ultimately become the very vulnerability that a predator would ruthlessly exploit. Shannon was deeply tethered to her family, maintaining strong, unbreakable bonds with her relatives, a fact that would later become the crucial catalyst in the relentless pursuit of justice following her death. She was not a woman who lived her life in the shadows or sought out danger. Rather, she sought the simple, profound comforts of a loving home, a shared future, and the quiet joy of daily domesticity. One of the most defining aspects of Shannon's life, and an element that would later be twisted into the central narrative of her own murder, was her profound, lifelong connection to animals, particularly horses. In the rural expanses of Michigan, equestrianism was not merely a hobby. For many, it was a fundamental way of life. Shannon found a deep, restorative peace in the presence of these massive, majestic creatures. She spent countless hours at local stables, intimately understanding the nuanced behaviors, the incredible strength, and the fragile temperaments of horses. She knew how to approach them, how to ride them safely, and how to read the subtle physical cues that indicated distress or agitation in an animal. This extensive experience and deep knowledge make the official, fabricated narrative of her death all the more chilling and logically inconsistent to those who truly knew her. The idea that a highly experienced, cautious equestrian like Shannon would suddenly fall victim to a catastrophic, fatal trampling incident under highly unusual circumstances should have immediately raised profound suspicions. Yet, her genuine love for the equestrian world provided her new husband with the ultimate, unquestionable stage upon which to direct his macabre theatrical production. To understand how a vibrant, intelligent woman like Shannon could be drawn into such a fatal snare, one must closely examine the complex, deeply deceptive persona of the man who constructed it. David Davis was a man who moved through the world cloaked in an aura of absolute authority and unquestionable competence. He was a commercial pilot, a profession that carried immense cultural prestige and demanded a specific, highly rigorous psychological profile. In 1980, commercial aviators were widely viewed by the general public as figures of absolute reliability, individuals entrusted with the lives of hundreds of passengers as they navigated complex machinery through the skies. To wear the uniform of a pilot was to wear a symbol of ultimate trust, discipline, and intellectual superiority. David weaponized this professional prestige with terrifying efficiency. He utilized his status not just as a career, but as a heavily fortified psychological shield that deflected any potential scrutiny or suspicion regarding his personal character. When people looked at David Davis, they did not see a deeply disturbed, controlling individual. They saw a highly successful, educated professional who had seemingly mastered the skies. However, beneath the polished exterior and the crisp, commanding presence lay a psychological landscape defined by a pathological, insatiable need for absolute control. The rigorous discipline and the strict adherence to protocol that made him a successful pilot mutated into a dark, suffocating tyranny within the intimate confines of his personal life. David possessed a deeply narcissistic personality architecture, viewing the people around him not as autonomous human beings with intrinsic value, but rather as instrumental extensions of his own grand ego. He lacked the fundamental capacity for genuine, selfless emotional connection, replacing authentic love with a clinical, calculating methodology of manipulation. To David, a marital relationship was not a partnership of equals. It was an acquisition, a strategic maneuver designed to serve his own specific, self-centered objectives. His intelligence, rather than being a tool for societal contribution, was exclusively dedicated to the meticulous orchestration of his own desires and the systematic elimination of any obstacles that stood in his way. He was a man who truly believed that his superior intellect elevated him entirely above the standard moral and legal frameworks that governed ordinary society. When David Davis first entered Shannon's life, he did not present himself as a controlling tyrant. Predators of a specific caliber rarely reveal their true nature in the initial stages of a courtship. Instead, he deployed a highly sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation, utilizing a technique often referred to as love bombing. He overwhelmed Shannon with intense affection, grand gestures, and an unwavering, seemingly devoted attention that was entirely designed to swiftly bypass her logical defenses. For a woman in her mid-30s who was actively seeking a stable, loving partnership, the sudden arrival of a handsome, highly successful pilot who appeared entirely devoted to her must have felt like the miraculous culmination of her deepest hopes. David carefully mirrored her desires, presenting himself as the ultimate protector, the perfect provider, and the definitive answer to her quest for a lifelong companion. He expertly crafted a deeply compelling illusion of a shared destiny, moving the relationship forward at an incredibly rapid, dizzying pace that intentionally left Shannon with little to no time to pause, reflect, or objectively evaluate the subtle, underlying dynamics of their connection. The courtship was remarkably brief, culminating in a hasty marriage that legally bound Shannon to a man she only truly knew through the carefully curated, deeply deceptive persona he had chosen to present. Almost immediately after the wedding vows were exchanged and the legal documents were finalized, the underlying, hidden architecture of their relationship began to subtly, yet undeniably, shift. The intense, overwhelming affection that had characterized their brief courtship slowly began to recede, rapidly replaced by a pervasive, chilling atmosphere of clinical control. David began to systematically isolate Shannon from her established support networks, slowly orchestrating a gradual physical and emotional distance between her and the family members who loved her most. He utilized subtle criticisms, manufactured conflicts, and his demanding professional schedule to slowly sever the vital lifelines that connected Shannon to her external world. This isolation was absolutely critical to his ultimate plan. A victim who is entirely cut off from outside perspectives is vastly easier to manipulate, control, and ultimately destroy without immediate external interference. Simultaneously, David began to initiate a series of calculated financial maneuvers that completely exposed the true, horrifying motive behind his sudden, whirlwind marriage. Under the heavy guise of responsible financial planning and securing their shared, long-term future, he convinced Shannon to agree to the establishment of massive life insurance policies, heavily naming himself as the sole, exclusive beneficiary. To a trusting, loving newlywed, such a request might easily be interpreted as a standard, deeply caring, and entirely pragmatic step taken by a responsible husband concerned about unforeseen tragedies. However, in the dark, calculating mind of David Davis, these extensive financial documents were not a safety net. They were a highly lucrative, binding contract on her life. He was actively, systematically establishing the financial framework that would handsomely reward him for the brutal murder he was already conceptualizing. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of securing such massive policies on a woman he had only just married speaks volumes about the depth of his sociopathy and his absolute, unwavering confidence in his ability to execute his lethal plan completely undetected. As the summer of 1980 slowly approached, the invisible, suffocating cage that David had meticulously constructed around Shannon was entirely complete. She was living in a state of profound, manufactured vulnerability, emotionally isolated from her protective family, legally bound to a ruthless predator, and carrying a massive financial bounty on her own head. She continued to go about her daily routines, visiting the horse farm she so deeply loved, completely unaware that the vast, open spaces of the rural Michigan landscape were rapidly transforming into the meticulously chosen stage for her execution. The man who slept beside her, the man who had promised to cherish and protect her, was quietly utilizing his advanced intelligence to research undetectable chemical agents, studying the exact physiological effects of synthetic muscle relaxants, and finalizing the precise, chilling choreography of a manufactured equestrian disaster. The profound tragedy of Shannon Davis lies not just in the brutal, terrifying manner of her physical death, but in the absolute, total betrayal of her inherent trust, a dark, devastating preamble to a crime that would soon shock the nation and trigger one of the most exhaustive, relentless international manhunts in the history of federal law enforcement. The transformation of a peaceful Michigan afternoon into a scene of calculated, cold-blooded murder was not the result of a sudden, impulsive eruption of violence, but the final, inevitable movement in a symphony of premeditation conducted by a man who viewed human life as a transactional variable. July 23, 1980, dawned as a day of deceptive stillness in Hillsdale County, where the sun hung heavy over the rolling, verdant pastures that surrounded the farmstead David Davis had selected as his execution ground. For Shannon, this was to be another day of pursuing the simple, grounded joy she cherished, a day of connection with the animals that provided her a sense of equilibrium. She had no way of knowing that the very sanctuary she sought was being utilized by her husband as a weaponized backdrop for her destruction. David, meanwhile, moved through the morning with the practiced, mechanical precision of an aviator preparing for a complex flight. Every action he took was designed to minimize the possibility of later discovery, to ensure that the narrative he was constructing would be airtight, compelling, and ultimately beyond the reach of a small-town police investigation. Inside the quiet confines of their home, the atmosphere was thick with the artificial calm that David insisted upon maintaining. He did not behave as a man about to commit an atrocity. He behaved as a man attending to necessary, mundane business. There was no visible agitation, no flicker of hesitation in his movements, and no outward sign of the monstrous intent he harbored. This clinical detachment was, perhaps, the most chilling aspect of his entire psychological makeup. As he prepared the instruments of his crime, he was not contending with the weight of morality or the paralyzing fear of consequences. He was focusing entirely on the technical efficacy of his plan. He had researched the pharmacological properties of succinylcholine with the same analytical intensity he applied to the mechanical systems of an aircraft. He understood that this agent, when administered correctly, would achieve exactly the result he demanded: total, absolute, and rapid paralysis, followed by a quiet, undetectable cessation of respiratory function. The beauty of the drug, from the perspective of a predator, was its elusive nature. It was designed to disappear, to leave the body in a state that would appear, at first glance, entirely consistent with a sudden medical event or a localized trauma, rather than a systematic chemical execution. The moment of the act itself was executed with a ruthless, surgical efficiency that stripped away any remaining remnants of humanity from the encounter. David did not approach Shannon with a weapon of blunt, overt violence that would draw blood or cause alarm. He approached her with the deceptive, intimate care of a loving spouse. The administration of the succinylcholine was performed with the clinical skill of an expert, a silent, invasive intrusion that immediately severed Shannon's link to her own physical body. The transition from active consciousness to a state of total, paralyzed entrapment was instantaneous. The horror of that transition, experienced by a woman who could perceive every detail of her surroundings but remained entirely unable to project a single signal of her terror, is a depth of suffering that defies standard articulation. She was rendered a prisoner within her own flesh, a passive witness to the final, fatal actions of the man she had believed was her protector. In those silent, agonizing minutes, as the drug suppressed the vital impulses required for her to draw breath, Shannon was subjected to the ultimate betrayal. Her trust, her love, and her life were all being systematically discarded in a cold, sterile experiment of control. Once the chemical had fulfilled its purpose, and the light of life had faded from Shannon's eyes, the second, equally crucial phase of David's choreography commenced. This was the theatrical production, the elaborate stagecraft designed to ensure that his actions would be interpreted by the local authorities not as a murder, but as a tragic freak accident. He carefully transported her body to the designated area on the farm, placing her in a position that suggested she had been caught in the path of a large, powerful animal. He then proceeded to inflict a series of calculated, heavy impacts upon her skin, creating the bruising and contusions that would serve as the foundational evidence for his manufactured story. This was not the chaotic, uncontrolled violence of a crime of passion. It was the deliberate, technical application of force intended to simulate the chaotic aftermath of an equestrian trampling. He was playing the role of the director, meticulously positioning every element to ensure that the final, visual impression left for the investigators would be one of absolute, undeniable misfortune. He left nothing to chance, anticipating the assumptions that law enforcement would inevitably make when confronted with the sight of a beloved horsewoman found dead in a pasture. The discovery of the scene followed the precise script David had written. When he finally sounded the alarm, his performance as the devastated, shocked widower was, by all outward accounts, entirely flawless. He leaned into the communal sympathy of the small town, projecting an image of profound, disbelieving grief that effectively neutralized any initial skepticism. The local police officers who responded to the scene found exactly what David intended for them to find: a young woman, deceased, in a setting consistent with her known passions and daily activities. In the absence of a forensic team capable of identifying the subtle, rapidly degrading traces of a specialized neuromuscular blocking agent, the investigators relied on the most obvious, readily available explanation. The combination of the visible, traumatic injuries on Shannon's body and the lack of any obvious evidence of an outside intruder led them, quite logically, to the conclusion that she had suffered a terrible, freak accident involving the horses. The ease with which the local authorities accepted this narrative was, for David, the ultimate validation of his own intellectual superiority. He had effectively used their trust, their limited investigative resources, and their basic human empathy as the primary tools in his own defense. In the days and weeks that followed, as the community rallied around the grieving husband, David continued to perform his role with an unwavering, clinical consistency. He accepted the condolences, participated in the rituals of mourning, and all the while began the systematic process of securing the financial rewards he had so carefully arranged. The insurance payout was not merely a monetary compensation for his loss, it was the final, tangible dividend of his successful deception. It represented the triumph of his cold, calculating methodology over the complexities of human emotion and legal systems. To the public eye, he was a figure of tragic nobility, a man who had lost his young wife to a cruel twist of fate and was now attempting to navigate the wreckage of his life. To the internal reality of David Davis, however, he was a pioneer of the perfect crime, an individual who had successfully demonstrated that the established boundaries of moral and legal accountability could be entirely bypassed by the application of sufficient technical knowledge and psychological control. Yet, even as he stood at the zenith of his deceptive success, the foundations of his narrative were beginning to show the first, faint cracks of instability. The grief of Shannon's family was not a passive, fading emotion. It was a deeply rooted, highly observant state of being that began to interrogate the inconsistencies in David's story. They remembered the subtle, controlling behaviors he had exhibited throughout the courtship, the way he had sought to isolate Shannon from their shared history, and the jarring, unsettling coldness that seemed to persist beneath the surface of his feigned mourning. Their intuition, an intangible but highly potent tool of truth, refused to align with the official, sanitized version of events. They knew Shannon's capabilities as a writer, and they found it impossible to reconcile her competence with the clumsiness implied by the supposed accident. The nagging, persistent questions that the local authorities had dismissed as the irrational responses of the bereaved became, in the hands of the family, the vital, driving force behind an entirely different type of investigation. They began to look beyond the scene, beyond the convenient narrative of the accident, and toward the character of the man who had stood to gain so much from the silence of his wife. This shift in perspective, from the passive acceptance of a tragedy to the active, investigative suspicion of a crime, was the first critical movement in the long, arduous process of unmasking a killer who believed himself entirely beyond the reach of the law. As the family's inquiries began to gain momentum, and as their persistent, relentless demands for a deeper, more rigorous forensic look at the evidence began to find receptive ears at the federal level, the carefully constructed, pristine reality of David Davis's perfect crime began its slow, inevitable collapse. The stage he had set was about to be dismantled, not by the small-town officials he had easily manipulated, but by the distant, patient, and increasingly focused eyes of federal investigators who did not care for theatrical narratives, but only for the cold, unyielding reality of the evidence itself. The shadow of his past, which he had thought to bury in the quiet hills of Michigan, was beginning to stretch and darken, preparing to follow him into the long, dark, and ultimately inescapable journey that lay ahead. The transition from a closed, cold case file sitting in a dusty rural drawer to an active, high-priority federal investigation was not a sudden explosion of activity, but rather a slow, grinding process of attrition against the false narrative David Davis had constructed. The family of Shannon Davis, driven by an agonizing, internal compass of truth that the police had mistakenly dismissed as mere grief, refused to let the case dissolve into the anonymity of time. They possessed something that David's clinical, transactional mind had entirely failed to account for: the fierce, unyielding persistence of love that seeks justice even when all institutional avenues appear exhausted. As they began to press beyond the local authorities, consistently raising red flags about the insurance policies, the timing of the marriage, and the unsettling psychological profile of the husband, their voices eventually reached the ears of those who operated with a much broader, more sophisticated investigative scope. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, with its access to specialized forensic resources and its institutional mandate to pursue complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes, began to perceive the faint, erratic pulse of an unsolved murder beneath the calm, professional veneer of a tragic equestrian accident. The process of reopening the investigation was characterized by a meticulous, systematic dismantling of every assumption that had allowed Davis to remain free. The first and most vital step was the exhumation of Shannon's remains, a profound, gut-wrenching event for her family, but an absolute necessity for the cause of truth. In the landscape of the early 1980s, forensic science was experiencing a critical evolution, moving away from reliance on purely visual evidence and toward the increasing precision of chemical and toxicological analysis. When the federal investigators authorized the examination of the tissue, they were not looking for the blunt trauma that David had staged. They were looking for the invisible, chemical markers of his true method. The discovery of trace elements of succinylcholine within her system served as the definitive, scientific death knell for his fabricated account of events. It was a moment of profound revelation, shifting the perception of the case from an unfortunate rural tragedy to a deliberate, premeditated homicide. The realization that a specialized neuromuscular blocking agent had been used to paralyze and asphyxiate a victim immediately transformed the suspect profile. This was no longer the work of a common criminal or a panic spouse. This was the work of someone with a high degree of technical knowledge, someone who understood the precise interplay between pharmacology and biology, and someone who felt entirely confident in their ability to manipulate the complexities of medical evidence. The federal agents, now operating with the weight of scientific proof, began to reconstruct the timeline of David's actions leading up to the murder, revealing a pattern of research and preparation that was as cold and calculated as the act itself. They examined the financial trail, discovering the aggressive, strategic nature of his efforts to secure the insurance payouts, and they began to interview those who had interacted with him during his brief marriage to Shannon. Every witness testimony, when viewed through the lens of the new, forensic evidence, began to reveal the same, consistent image: a man who was deeply controlling, emotionally detached, and fundamentally manipulative. The investigation, which had once been hindered by a lack of insight, was now accelerating with the force of undeniable, objective truth. It was at this critical juncture that David Davis, a man who possessed the acute awareness of a pilot navigating a dangerous, turbulent flight, sensed the shifting atmospheric pressure of the legal environment. He understood that the forensic evidence he had considered undetectable was now being leveraged against him with a level of rigor he had not anticipated. He did not wait for the formal issuance of an arrest warrant to materialize. With the calculated instinct of a predator, he recognized that his position was becoming untenable and that the carefully constructed architecture of his freedom was rapidly beginning to disintegrate. He chose, in a move that was both desperate and entirely characteristic of his psychological profile, to simply cease being the man who had committed the crime. He began the process of systematic erasure, dismantling his identity with the same precision he had applied to the murder itself. This was not a panic flight, it was a highly organized departure. He liquidated assets, severed his remaining personal and professional ties with a chilling, total efficiency, and began to move through the North American landscape as a ghost. He traversed the country, utilizing his skills as an aviator to navigate through the complex, often unmonitored routes of the private aviation sector, and eventually found himself in the expansive, unforgiving wilds of Alaska. Here, he believed he could lose himself in the immense, rugged landscape, a place where identity was fluid and the past was something that could be left behind in the snow. He adopted new aliases, each one carefully curated to provide him with a plausible, unremarkable history, and he existed in a state of perpetual, vigilant anonymity. The federal investigation, meanwhile, was expanding into a massive, multi-state manhunt. Agents were tracing his movements across the continent, piecing together the fragmented trail of his flight. They understood that they were not just pursuing a suspect, they were pursuing a highly intelligent, elusive individual who was constantly adjusting his trajectory to avoid detection. The manhunt, which lasted for several long, grueling years, became a contest between the institutional patience of the federal government and the individual desperation of a killer. It was a period defined by quiet, intense effort, as investigators followed every possible lead, analyzed every piece of potential evidence, and maintained a constant, focused pressure on the network of individuals that David had interacted with during his escape. For the family of Shannon Davis, This period was one of agonizing uncertainty. They lived with the knowledge that the man who had destroyed their lives was still out there, moving through the world with a false name and a stolen sense of normalcy. Their persistence, however, remained the cornerstone of the investigation. They provided the constant, emotional impetus for the agents to continue, refusing to allow the case to be deprioritized even as the years passed without a major breakthrough. It was this intersection of familial devotion and professional determination that kept the pursuit alive. As David Davis moved from the rugged isolation of Alaska to the remote, tropical reaches of the South Pacific, he believed he had finally secured the ultimate, impenetrable sanctuary. He looked at the vast, blue expanse of the ocean as a natural barrier, an insurmountable divide that would forever separate him from the consequences of his actions in Michigan. He arrived in American Samoa with the confidence of a man who had successfully outrun his own history. He did not arrive as a man in hiding, but as a man who intended to establish a new, permanent existence. He leveraged his aviation background to secure employment, he integrated himself into the local community, and he fostered relationships that were entirely built upon the foundation of his fabricated identity. He was, to the eyes of those around him, an asset to the local society, a man of intellect and professional competence. He married again, fathering a child and building a domestic life that looked, from the outside, entirely conventional and stable. This was the final, audacious act of his deception, to weave himself so deeply into the fabric of a new, distant society that the very idea of his previous life would seem like an impossible fiction. He felt entirely secure in his isolation, believing that the distance he had traveled, coupled with the persona he had so carefully maintained, rendered him invisible to the reach of the law. He remained unaware, however, that the federal investigation had not ceased, nor had it ever lost its focus. The agents were not merely tracking his path, they were waiting for the inevitable moment when his new life would intersect with the reality of his past. The reach of the law was not defined by physical distance, but by the relentless, methodical pursuit of truth. The investigation had moved into an international dimension, utilizing media and global communication channels to broadcast his image and his identity, turning the entire world into a potential watchful eye. It was only a matter of time before the isolation he had so carefully chosen would be breached, and the life he had built upon a foundation of lies would finally, irrevocably collapse under the weight of the justice he had spent 7 years running from. The stage for his ultimate capture was not a scene of high-speed pursuit, but a quiet, sudden confrontation that would strip away his carefully curated identity and confront him with the inescapable, physical reality of his own monstrous actions, bringing an end to his long, desperate flight across the edge of the world. The conclusion of the David Davis saga serves as a somber, enduring testament to the fundamental tension between the arrogance of a predatory mind and the inexorable, long-term reach of institutional justice. When we reflect upon the 7 years between the death of Shannon Davis in the quiet fields of Michigan and the final, jarring arrest on the tropical shores of American Samoa, we are not merely observing a sequence of criminal events, we are examining the profound, often terrifying persistence of human consequences. David Davis operated under the fatal, narcissistic delusion that he could intellectually outmaneuver the very structures designed to maintain societal order. He viewed his life as a series of strategic maneuvers, the selection of a victim, the acquisition of a lethal agent, the engineering of a deceptive accident, and the subsequent, multi-continental escape, as if he were playing a high-stakes game of chess against opponents he deemed fundamentally inferior to himself. Yet the tragedy he authored did not exist in a vacuum. It resonated through the lives of the family he shattered and the communities he briefly inhabited, eventually building a momentum of investigative truth that no amount of professional deception could indefinitely delay. The legacy of this case remains a foundational lesson in the evolution of criminal investigation and the critical importance of interagency cooperation. In 1980, the barriers to solving a crime involving an elusive suspect and sophisticated, rapidly degrading forensic evidence were immense. The success of the eventual capture demonstrates that while a perpetrator can manipulate the immediate, local understanding of an event, they cannot easily evade the collective, patient attention of federal investigators when that attention is sustained by the persistence of those who love the victim. Shannon's family played a role that is often overlooked in the clinical documentation of true crime, but is, in reality, the most essential component. They were the guardians of the truth when the official records had already been marked as closed. Their refusal to accept the neat, sanitized narrative of a horse-riding accident provided the necessary friction to restart an engine of investigation that had been silenced by a combination of rural trust and tactical misdirection. This case underlines a painful but vital reality. Justice is rarely a spontaneous outcome. It is the result of tireless, often invisible labor undertaken by those who refuse to let the truth be buried. Furthermore, the story of David Davis forces an uncomfortable contemplation of the duality inherent in human nature, particularly regarding those who exist within positions of professional authority. As a pilot, Davis was entrusted with the lives of others, expected to embody the highest standards of reliability, composure, and integrity. This professional mantle provided him with a unique, tactical advantage that he ruthlessly exploited. It allowed him to move through the world with a veneer of normalcy that shielded him from the scrutiny typically directed at those with darker, more turbulent internal lives. This should serve as a permanent caution to society. Professional achievement, technical competence, and the projection of authority are not, in themselves, indicators of moral character or psychological stability. The same discipline that allows a pilot to navigate complex aircraft can, in a predatory individual, be repurposed to execute a murder with chilling, meticulous precision. We must recognize that the most dangerous individuals are often those who can most effectively mimic the behaviors and roles that we, as a society, have come to automatically trust. The long journey from the Michigan farm to the South Pacific also highlights the changing landscape of modern crime, where distance and anonymity have been systematically dismantled by the interconnected nature of global communication. David's belief that he could vanish into the cultural and geographical isolation of Samoa was, in hindsight, a critical miscalculation. He failed to appreciate that the modern world, even in its most remote corners, is no longer a place of absolute seclusion. The media and the reach of information channels that he utilized to build his new, respectable persona were the very same channels that ultimately broadcasted his true identity back to those who were searching for him. The globalization of information creates a situation where a perpetrator's past is no longer confined to the location of their crime, but is, instead, a shadow that can travel as rapidly as the data itself. This reality has fundamentally shifted the nature of evasion, making the pursuit of justice an international, collaborative effort that can span oceans and decades with equal, relentless efficiency. When we consider the life of Shannon Davis, we are reminded that every true crime narrative, no matter how technical or procedural it may become, begins and ends with the irretrievable loss of a human life. Shannon was more than just the first move in a game of deception. She was a woman with hopes, connections, and a future that was violently stolen by the one person she had most trusted. The chilling efficiency of the succinylcholine, the cruelty of the staged scene, and the subsequent years of the killer's evasion are not just academic details, they are components of a profound, lingering injustice that only began to be addressed when the truth was finally brought to light. The dedication shown by the FBI in pursuing the case long after the initial trail had gone cold speaks to the essential dignity that is owed to a victim, affirming that a life, once taken, remains a debt that the system is obligated to pursue, regardless of how difficult, expensive, or time-consuming the path may be. The book Murderous Intent and the various televised retellings of the story have served to cement David Davis's actions within the annals of criminal history, not as an example of a mastermind, but as an example of the ultimate, futile desperation of the human ego. He spent the best years of his life running from a past that he could never truly leave behind, trading his freedom and his true self for a hollow, fabricated existence that was destined to collapse. His life in Samoa, while outwardly appearing successful, was in reality a claustrophobic prison of his own making, where every interaction was colored by the need to maintain a lie and every moment was potentially his last of freedom. The psychological toll of such an existence is arguably a punishment as profound as the legal one that eventually followed. He had to live every day in the knowledge that he was a ghost, a construct, and that his continued survival was entirely dependent on the ignorance of those around him. When the end finally came, it was not merely an arrest. It was an act of liberation from the burden of the lie he had been forced to maintain for so many years. In the final assessment, the story of David Davis is one of a man who thought he could outrun his own reality, only to discover that the law, like the truth, has a long memory and an even longer reach. His life after the crime was a descent into a desperate, hollow survival, and his eventual incarceration in Michigan was the formal recognition that he had never actually escaped his crime at all. The justice that was delivered in 1987 was the only possible conclusion to a narrative that had begun in a moment of cold, calculated brutality. It provides a measure of closure for a family that never wavered in their search for the truth, and it stands as a reminder that even the most meticulously prepared illusions will eventually fail when they are brought into the relentless, unforgiving light of forensic science and federal determination. We are left with the quiet, sobering knowledge that while some crimes are designed to be forgotten, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, waiting for the moment when it can finally, inevitably be told. The legacy of this case is not the ingenuity of the killer, but the resilience of the truth, a reality that persists long after the headlines have faded and the files have been stored away in the permanent records of history. It serves as a haunting, cautionary tale of how quickly a life can be destroyed and how far the pursuit of justice will travel to ensure that those responsible for such darkness are finally and permanently brought to account for the lives they have forever altered and the shadows they have cast upon the world. The story of David Davis is ultimately a lesson in the permanence of action and the inescapable nature of accountability, ensuring that while the perpetrator may believe they have rewritten their history, the record of their true self remains, etched in the evidence and remembered by the lives they have shattered and the justice they could not indefinitely deny. The conclusion of the legal saga and the subsequent period of public reflection brought about a profound sense of institutional stability that had been severely tested during the long years of the trial. As the dust settled and the daily routines of Fagatogo resumed their familiar rhythms, the community began to integrate the tragedy into its collective memory, not as an open wound, but as a somber chapter of history that provided vital lessons for the future. The decision to permanently remove the perpetrator from the territory was not merely a logistical necessity for security. It was a symbolic act of purging the violence that had been injected into the peaceful heart of the island. By ensuring that Siamo Jr. would spend the rest of his life in a federal institution thousands of miles away, the government effectively signaled to the citizens that the peace of American Samoa was a protected domain, and that the kind of radical, vengeful violence displayed on that July morning had no place in their society. This action allowed the residents to reclaim their environment, transforming the courthouse parking lot from a site of lingering horror back into the mundane center of administrative life. The legacy of the case also prompted a significant shift in the internal policies of the police force, leading to comprehensive reforms that extended far beyond standard security protocols. The department recognized that the modern age required a different level of awareness, even for a community as tightly integrated as theirs. This shift did not involve the militarization of the police, which would have been antithetical to the local culture, but rather an enhancement of training, communication, and situational readiness. Officers were encouraged to engage more deeply with the families and the various clans of the island, fostering a level of trust that could serve as a preventative measure against the kind of isolation and paranoia that had fueled the perpetrator's rage. This strategy of deep, relational policing became a central tenet of the department's philosophy, recognizing that true public safety is not achieved through defensive barriers alone, but through the strength of the social fabric that connects the enforcers of the law to the individuals they serve. The memory of Lieutenant Brown became a standard-bearer for this new approach, representing a balance between the stoic, traditional service of the past and the sophisticated, community-oriented awareness required for the future. In the years following the resolution of the legal proceedings, the High Court of American Samoa also underwent a quiet but significant transformation in how it approached high-profile criminal cases. The judiciary learned the hard way about the dangers of institutional delay and the fragility of a legal system that lacks robust, clear, and actionable sentencing frameworks. There was a renewed emphasis on procedural efficiency, ensuring that the wheels of justice would continue to turn even when faced with complex constitutional questions. The experience of the trial served as a masterclass in the necessity of administrative preparedness, encouraging the territorial legislature to review and clarify the laws governing capital and severe felony cases to avoid a repeat of the frustrating limbo that had defined the Siamo case. This commitment to procedural clarity was an essential step in maintaining the integrity of the judiciary, proving to the public that the system was capable of learning from its mistakes and evolving to meet the demands of the modern era. The court remained a place of solemnity, but it was now supported by a deeper understanding of its own capacity to manage even the most horrific of circumstances. The emotional recovery of the island was, perhaps, the most delicate and protracted aspect of the aftermath. Grief, when sustained for years by the uncertainty of a legal process, does not vanish simply because a verdict is handed down. It changes form, becoming a permanent, quiet part of the community's shared landscape. For the families of the victims, the resolution brought a bittersweet closure, a finality that honored their loss but could never replace the empty chair at the dinner table. The way the community rallied around these families, offering support, recognizing their trauma, and collectively mourning the loss of Lou Brown, served as a powerful validation of the island's social ethos. It demonstrated that the strength of a society is not tested when everything is going well, but in the moments when its members are forced to confront the worst of human nature together. The compassion shown during those years was the antithesis of the violence that had prompted the crisis, acting as a soft, continuous, and healing force that slowly mended the frayed edges of the public spirit. As we look at the broader implications for American Samoa, the case serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of geographical and cultural context in the administration of justice. The territory, as an unincorporated part of the United States, exists at the intersection of American legal mandates and traditional indigenous governance. Navigating this intersection in the face of a brutal crime requires a high degree of wisdom, patience, and a steadfast commitment to the values that define the people. The case proved that there is no universal, one-size-fits-all solution for criminal justice. Rather, the most effective response is one that respects the cultural and moral framework of the community while upholding the rule of law. The fact that the territory chose to honor its cultural aversion to state-sanctioned execution, even while facing extreme pressure for vengeance, is a hallmark of its unique identity. It established a precedent that the island would chart its own moral course, rooted in the collective conscience of its people, rather than simply mimicking the practices of the mainland. Looking toward the horizon, the lessons learned from the events of 2010 continue to influence the discourse of safety and justice in the territory. The discussion about what it means to be a safe community, how to address the underlying causes of deep-seated anger, and how to maintain the sanctity of public institutions remains relevant and necessary. The story has become part of the educational curriculum for new police recruits, a narrative of both the cost of violence and the necessity of bravery. It serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked grievance and the critical importance of intervention at the earliest signs of instability. Every time a new officer puts on their uniform, the story of Lieutenant Lou Brown serves as a guiding light, a reminder of the responsibility they carry and the deep respect they owe to the community that entrusts them with its peace. The tragedy has been integrated into the identity of the police force, making it a source of inspiration rather than a point of despair. The narrative of this case also holds a global relevance, particularly for other small, interconnected communities grappling with the pressures of the modern world. In a global landscape that is increasingly characterized by rapid change and the erosion of traditional community ties, the experience of American Samoa serves as a vital case study in the power of resilience. It proves that the identity of a society is not a fixed asset but an active, ongoing construction that must be defended and reaffirmed every single day. The commitment to peaceful resolution, the rejection of reactive brutality, and the dedication to the hard, slow work of healing are universal values that hold the potential to mend even the most fractured communities. By sharing this story, we are not just recounting a dark moment in history, we are presenting a blueprint for how a small society can face an existential threat and emerge not only intact but wiser, stronger, and more profoundly committed to the preservation of life. Ultimately, the story of the shooting at the Fagatogo courthouse is one of light triumphing over darkness, not through a sudden miracle, but through the persistent, unified effort of a community that refused to be destroyed by one man's hate. The memory of Lieutenant Lou Brown now stands as a symbol of the island's endurance, a permanent part of the Fagatogo landscape, and a beacon that lights the way for the future. The long road from that July morning to the finality of the legal resolution has been a journey through the valley of the shadow of death, but it has led to a place of greater understanding, sharper focus, and a renewed dedication to the things that matter most: the safety of the harbor, the sanctity of the family, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The island continues its existence in the vast Pacific, unchanged in its beauty, but forever altered by the history it has survived. It remains a testament to the belief that peace is not just the absence of conflict, but the active presence of harmony, a harmony that must be cherished, protected, and fought for with all the resilience that a community can muster in the face of its most difficult trials. The history is written, the lessons are learned, and the future is guarded by the memory of those who stood firm when the world turned cold, ensuring that the legacy of peace remains the defining character of their home, forever echoing through the palm trees and the quiet, rolling waves of their cherished ancestral lands. The finality of the courtroom verdict in 1987 did not simply mark the end of an active investigation. It served as the definitive, historical bookend to a narrative that had challenged the boundaries of legal pursuit for nearly a decade. When we contemplate the vast, intricate expanse of this case, from the initial, quiet deception in rural Michigan to the final, jarring realization on the shores of American Samoa, we are confronted with the reality that justice is often a marathon, not a sprint. The resolution of David Davis's path through the judicial system was not an instantaneous triumph, but the culmination of thousands of hours of painstaking, methodical work by investigators who viewed the quest for truth not merely as a professional duty, but as a moral imperative. By looking back at the entire trajectory, we can see how the interplay between modern forensic innovation and the unyielding persistence of the human spirit finally managed to dismantle an illusion that had been crafted with the cold, deliberate precision of a master manipulator. The transformation of the investigation from a localized oversight into an international manhunt highlights a critical, often overlooked aspect of the criminal justice system: its capacity for institutional memory. While an individual perpetrator may change their name, their location, their career, and even their entire persona, the evidentiary record of their crime remains static and immutable. Davis believed that by traveling across the globe, he was creating distance that would act as an effective shield against the law, failing to understand that the information society would eventually make such physical barriers obsolete. The legal framework had not only tracked his progress, but it had effectively kept pace with the evolution of his own deceptions, waiting for the precise moment when the internal contradictions of his fabricated identity would become visible to the outside world. This reveals a fundamental truth about criminal behavior. No matter how complex the ruse or how distant the sanctuary, the truth acts as a constant, tethering force that eventually pulls the perpetrator back to the scene of their original transgression. Looking closely at the internal psychological collapse of the fugitive, we see the profound, inevitable strain caused by living a life entirely predicated on a lie. For the years that he spent in American Samoa, Davis was not truly living in freedom. He was inhabiting a self-imposed, high-stakes prison where every interaction was a calculated risk and every day was a performance of his own invention. The psychological cost of this constant vigilance is often underestimated when we discuss the lives of those on the run. They are forced to suppress their history, to monitor their speech for slips in the narrative, and to live with the persistent, underlying terror that their past may at any moment reach out to claim them. In many ways, his final apprehension by the FBI provided a form of internal release from the exhausting, meticulous effort required to maintain his false existence. The moment he was taken into custody was the moment he could finally cease the act, as the weight of his hidden reality was finally and permanently lifted from his own shoulders and transferred back to the responsibility of the state. The impact of this case on the families of victims is another element that deserves a deep, empathetic analysis. The family of Shannon Davis experienced a decade of profound, agonizing uncertainty, living through the pain of her loss while simultaneously engaging in the exhausting, relentless battle to prove that her death was not an accident. Their experience highlights the immense emotional burden placed on those who must act as the primary, persistent advocates for the truth when the official, initial conclusion of the authorities is demonstrably wrong. Their journey from the initial, traumatic realization of her death to the final, judicial confirmation of her murder illustrates the incredible, quiet heroism required of those left behind. They did not succumb to the ease of accepting a tragic, yet convenient explanation. They held the truth in their hearts and demanded that the system finally, irrevocably validate it. It is because of their dedication that the name of Shannon Davis remains defined by her life and her innocence, rather than by the cold, manufactured narrative that her killer had so ruthlessly attempted to impose upon her memory. As we analyze the technical aspects of the case, the role of forensic science stands out as the ultimate, inescapable arbiter of guilt. The shift in 1980 from a system that relied on visual, external evidence to one that integrated internal, toxicological analysis was the pivotal factor that rendered Davis's plan obsolete. He had bet his entire life on the assumption that science would never be able to look beneath the surface, that the chemical nature of the succinylcholine would remain hidden in the decaying remains of his victim. He was, in this regard, a man who believed he was operating in a technological era that had already passed, failing to anticipate that the advancement of the very tools he feared would eventually provide the irrefutable evidence required to dismantle his facade. This underscores the necessity of constant, rigorous scientific evolution within the justice system. It is the ongoing improvement of these analytical techniques that ensures that even the most well-hidden, sophisticated crimes cannot remain in the dark forever. The societal implications of a person like David Davis being able to operate within trusted, professional circles for so long are truly unsettling. He utilized his status as a commercial pilot to build a platform of implicit trust that allowed him to move through the world with a degree of access and anonymity that a common criminal would never possess. We often associate criminality with certain demographics, environments, or behaviors, yet the case of Davis proves that the most dangerous, calculated predators are often those who can most easily conform to the structures of success and authority. This should prompt a deeper, more critical examination of how we attribute trust to individuals based on their professional roles and how we might develop better, more objective ways to evaluate the character of those we allow into our intimate, personal, and domestic lives. His case is a chilling reminder that the outward appearance of stability is not a substitute for the reality of a person's moral and emotional makeup. Ultimately, the resolution of this case serves as a powerful, enduring reminder of the permanence of truth in a world that is increasingly defined by the fluidity of digital and personal identities. Despite his best, most intelligent efforts to rewrite his own history and disappear into the vast, blue unknown, Davis could never erase the foundational facts of his crime. The evidentiary record, once established, acted as a permanent, anchor-like reality that eventually brought the entire structure of his deceit crashing down. For the modern student of criminal history, this case offers a clear, sobering lesson. The pursuit of justice, when fueled by the persistence of love and the rigorous application of forensic truth, is an inexorable process that will eventually find its mark, regardless of how long the chase may last or how far the fugitive may travel. It is a story that brings a measure of necessary, final peace to the memory of the victim and reinforces the vital, collective belief that no one is truly beyond the reach of accountability. The files of the David Davis case, now stored away in the permanent archives of history, stand as a testament to the fact that while a killer may believe they have successfully mastered the art of disappearance, they have in fact only succeeded in extending the time and the distance that the law will travel to finally bring them home to face the inevitable, cold light of justice. The echoes of his 7-year flight, which once filled the headlines and the imaginations of a nation, have finally settled into the quiet, historical recognition of a crime that was brought to its conclusion not by the brilliance of the predator, but by the relentless, unfolding, and ultimately totalizing nature of the truth itself, ensuring that the legacy of his actions is defined not by his successful escape, but by his final, permanent imprisonment and the enduring, clear-eyed recognition of the justice that was served for Shannon Davis. The final reflection on the case of David Davis requires us to look past the procedural mechanics of his capture and the dramatic geography of his flight to confront the enduring, existential shadow cast by such a profoundly calculated act of betrayal. When we examine the life of a man who chose to weaponize his own intellect against the person he had formerly promised to cherish, we are forced to grapple with the uncomfortable fragility of the domestic sphere. A home, in its ideal form, is the ultimate sanctuary, a space where the inherent vulnerabilities of human existence are protected by the mutual, unspoken contract of shared trust. In the case of Shannon Davis, that sanctuary was not merely violated by an external intruder, it was hollowed out from within by the very person who held the keys. This is the deepest, most chilling resonance of the entire narrative, the realization that the most dangerous potential for destruction often resides behind the most serene and conventional of facades. The ability of Davis to seamlessly transition from a cold-blooded murderer to a respected, family-oriented member of an island community in American Samoa speaks to a degree of psychological fluidity that is both terrifying and, in a clinical sense, deeply instructive. The narrative of his evasion, which spanned over 7 years, acts as a harrowing exploration of the human capacity for denial and the persistence of the ego. Davis did not merely move through space. He actively constructed a reality where his past actions were rendered non-existent by the sheer force of his will and the efficiency of his new identity. This process of self-erasure is a hallmark of the most dangerous perpetrators, as it allows them to maintain a sense of internal equilibrium even while they are living in a state of total, catastrophic moral failure. By immersing himself in the rhythms of a remote, tropical society, he was attempting to create a new, unblemished biography that would retroactively justify his survival. However, this project was fundamentally doomed by the objective, material reality of the crime he had left behind in Michigan. His mistake was in believing that his subjective experience of his own life, his newfound respectability, his domestic bliss, his career as an island pilot, could somehow supersede the hard, unforgiving forensic truth of the murder he had committed. The truth, in this instance, functioned as a fixed coordinate that he could never truly leave, regardless of how far he flew or how many names he adopted. As we consider the legal aftermath and the eventual sentencing, we are reminded that the justice system, while often frustratingly slow and prone to administrative inertia, possesses a singular, unmatched capacity for long-term retention. The federal investigators who pursued David Davis were not governed by the short-term pressures of the news cycle. They were governed by the slow, relentless demand of the evidentiary record. This institutional patience is perhaps the most significant safeguard against the efforts of those who believe they can outlast the reach of the law. The case serves as an enduring reminder that every action leaves a trace, and that in the modern era, the capacity to reconstruct those traces has increased exponentially. The advancements in forensic science that finally unmask the truth of the succinylcholine are a testament to the fact that scientific progress is a relentless ally of the truth, consistently narrowing the space in which a criminal can hide their methodology from the light of examination. The role of media in the resolution of this case also presents a complex, multifaceted subject for reflection. While the dissemination of information was the very thing that allowed Davis to hide in plain sight for so long, it was also the mechanism that finally facilitated his capture. The public, acting as an expansive, decentralized investigative network, served as the ultimate net that caught him when the initial, official efforts had failed. This dynamic illustrates how the line between the private pursuit of justice and the public acknowledgement of a crime has become increasingly blurred in our globalized environment. The story of David Davis became a shared cultural cautionary tale, a piece of information that existed in the collective memory of the public until it intersected with the reality of his existence on the island. It suggests that, in the modern world, total anonymity is an increasingly impossible goal for those who have committed actions that leave a permanent, factual scar upon the historical record. Reflecting on the life of Shannon Davis allows us to refocus the narrative away from the predatory ambitions of her killer and back toward the fundamental human value that was lost. Her journey through the legal system, though posthumous, served to restore her agency in a way that the crime itself had attempted to strip away. Through the persistence of her family and the eventual success of the prosecution, she ceased to be a passive victim of a staged accident and was instead recognized as a woman whose life had been systematically and violently ended by a man who had manipulated her trust. This act of restorative justice, while it cannot bring her back, does serve a vital, symbolic function in our societal need to address the imbalance caused by an act of cold-blooded murder. It validates the grief of her family, honors the memory of her potential, and ensures that her killer is defined in the eyes of history by the act of his brutality, not by the ingenuity of his flight. The psychological legacy of David Davis also warrants a final, sobering consideration. What drives a man to invest such immense intellectual and emotional energy into a process of systematic destruction? It is a question that leads us into the heart of a sociopathic condition, where the lack of empathy and the elevation of the ego create a vacuum in which extreme violence can appear, to the perpetrator, as a logical, necessary, and even brilliant solution to a personal conflict. His life was not one of impulsive chaos, but of high-functioning control, which is perhaps more disturbing than the common, disorganized crime of passion. It implies a capability for sustained, cold-blooded observation that is rarely acknowledged in our standard cultural depictions of murderers. We are forced to ask ourselves how many individuals walk among us, masked by the appearance of professional competence and social reliability, who harbor similar, unarticulated impulses, waiting for the right, calculated moment to transform their environment into a stage for their own, private, and terrible purposes. As the chapter on this case finally closes, we are left with the sense that the justice delivered in 1987 was not just an outcome, but a necessary correction to a profound distortion of reality. The return of David Davis to the jurisdiction of his crime was the final step in restoring the logical order of things, ensuring that the geography of his life was once again centered on the reality of his actions rather than the fantasy of his escape. For all the complexity of the investigation, the core of the story is remarkably, devastatingly simple. A man committed a crime. He spent years trying to convince the world and himself that he hadn't, and eventually, the weight of the truth became too great to sustain. It is a story that persists because it encapsulates the fundamental, optimistic belief that the truth will, eventually, and despite all possible obstructions, reach the light. In conclusion, the legacy of this case is etched into the very fabric of how we understand the pursuit of accountability. It reminds us that no amount of professional prestige, no length of distance, and no degree of manipulative intelligence can permanently overwrite the truth of a human life lost and a justice denied. The memory of the case remains as a guide for those who currently struggle with the weight of unresolved injustices, offering them a silent, persistent affirmation that their refusal to abandon the truth is not in vain. The story of the man who thought he could fly above the reach of the law, only to be brought down by the very reality he tried to escape, stands as a final, permanent monument to the impossibility of outrunning one's own history. The archives have closed, the sentence has been served, and the truth of Shannon Davis remains, finally and securely, at the center of a story where it has always belonged, serving as a beacon of reality in a world where the shadows of deception are constantly and inevitably forced to dissipate under the relentless, brightening light of historical, forensic, and absolute truth. This is the ultimate, quiet dignity of justice, that it survives the evasion, the time, and the distance to finally, inevitably, demand its own, complete and final fulfillment. L'ultime chapitre de cette saga judiciaire, bien au-delà de la conclusion des procédures pénales et de l'incarcération définitive de David Davis, nous invite à une méditation profonde sur la nature de la justice et sur l'empreinte indélébile que laissent les tragédies humaines dans la trame de notre existence commune. Lorsque nous contemplons la trajectoire complète de cette affaire, depuis la quiétude apparente des campagnes du Michigan jusqu'au dénouement sur les rivages lointains des Samoa américaines, nous sommes saisis par la réalisation que la justice ne consiste pas seulement en une série d'étapes administratives, mais en une quête spirituelle et morale de rétablissement de la vérité. Le destin de David Davis ne représente pas seulement l'histoire d'un criminel arrêté, mais celle d'une illusion systématiquement détruite par la persistance inlassable de ceux qui, refusant le silence et l'oubli, ont fait de la mémoire de Shannon Davis le phare guidant l'ensemble de leurs actions. Cette affaire, dans son essence même, démontre que la vérité n'est pas une donnée passive qui attend d'être découverte, mais une force active et dynamique qui finit toujours par s'imposer, quelles que soient les couches de dissimulation ou les distances géographiques que le coupable cherche à interposer entre lui et ses actes. Le cheminement de cette affaire souligne l'importance capitale de la résilience familiale face à l'adversité institutionnelle. La famille de Shannon, dans son refus catégorique d'accepter la thèse commode de l'accident équestre, a incarné ce que l'on pourrait appeler une vigilance éthique. Leur conviction, nourrie par une connaissance intime de la victime et par une intuition profonde, a agi comme le premier levier de ce qui allait devenir une traque internationale. En refusant de se soumettre à la facilité des conclusions hâtives des autorités locales de l'époque, Ils ont forcé le système à se regarder en face et à admettre ses propres lacunes. Cette leçon est fondamentale pour comprendre comment, dans un monde souvent distrait par les apparences, la ténacité des proches peut transformer une tragédie ignorée en un dossier judiciaire de haute priorité. Il nous rappelle que le deuil, lorsqu'il est privé de justice, reste une plaie ouverte et que le travail de reconstruction personnelle est intrinsèquement lié à la reconnaissance publique du mal qui a été commis. C'est dans cette perspective que le verdict de culpabilité, bien des années plus tard, a agi comme un baume, non pas pour effacer la douleur, mais pour valider la réalité de l'existence de Shannon et pour clore le chapitre de la manipulation. Sur le plan technique et forensique, l'affaire Davis demeure un cas d'école illustrant l'évolution fulgurante des méthodes d'investigation criminelle. Le recours au succinylcholine, choisi par Davis pour sa capacité à se dissiper rapidement dans l'organisme, témoignait d'une volonté manifeste de détourner les outils de la science médicale au profit d'une exécution calculée. Cependant, il a sous-estimé l'ingéniosité des toxicologues et des enquêteurs fédéraux qui, en repoussant les limites de l'analyse, ont fini par déceler les traces chimiques de sa monstrueuse machination. Cette victoire de la science sur le crime sophistiqué souligne un principe essentiel: la technologie progresse, et avec elle, la capacité de la justice à faire parler les morts. Rien, pas même le temps ou la décomposition, ne peut indéfiniment occulter une vérité scientifique. Chaque avancée dans les méthodes de détection renforce la sécurité collective, rendant la tâche des criminels d'aujourd'hui et de demain toujours plus périlleuse, car l'histoire montre que même les preuves les plus ténues finissent par émerger de l'ombre pour condamner ceux qui pensaient avoir trouvé le crime parfait. Le profil psychologique de David Davis, quant à lui, nous pousse à interroger les limites de la confiance sociale dans nos institutions et nos relations interpersonnelles. Comment un individu capable d'un tel niveau de froideur a-t-il pu évoluer si longtemps au sein de structures valorisant l'ordre et la compétence, comme l'aviation commerciale? Cette interrogation n'est pas seulement criminologique, elle est sociologique. Elle met en lumière le danger de nos propres biais cognitifs. Nous avons tendance à accorder une confiance aveugle à ceux qui arborent les attributs de la réussite sociale ou professionnelle. Davis a utilisé cette confiance comme une arme, se forgeant un masque d'honorabilité qui lui a permis de dissimuler sa psychose de contrôle derrière des uniformes et des titres respectables. Cette réalité doit nous inciter à une vigilance accrue et à une évaluation plus critique de nos interactions quotidiennes. Elle nous rappelle que le mal ne porte pas toujours le visage de la marginalité, mais peut tout aussi bien se dissimuler derrière un sourire poli, une compétence technique reconnue ou une intégration parfaite au sein d'une communauté soudée, comme il l'a si habilement démontré au Samoa. En considérant l'exil de Davis, on ne peut s'empêcher de réfléchir à la nature illusoire de la fuite en avant. Pendant 7 ans, il a cru que l'espace pouvait être un substitut à l'absence de remords. Pourtant, chaque jour passé sur cette île paradisiaque n'était qu'une répétition, une performance épuisante destinée à maintenir un personnage qui, au fond, n'existait pas. Sa fuite ne l'a pas éloigné de son crime, elle l'a au contraire enfermé dans une prison mentale bien plus exiguë que celle dans laquelle il allait finir ses jours. Le silence qu'il recherchait n'était pas la paix, mais une solitude peuplée par le spectre de ce qu'il avait accompli. À mesure que les années passaient, la peur d'être découvert devait croître en proportion directe avec l'attachement qu'il développait pour sa nouvelle vie. C'est là le paradoxe tragique du criminel en cavale. Plus il cherche à s'enraciner, plus il devient vulnérable à la vérité qui finit toujours par refaire surface, porté par le flux incessant de l'information et la vigilance constante de ceux qui n'oublient jamais. Le dénouement de cette affaire au Samoa, avec l'intervention coordonnée des autorités fédérales et locales, est une démonstration de l'efficacité de la coopération internationale en matière de lutte contre la grande criminalité. La mondialisation des échanges et des données a rendu le monde beaucoup plus petit pour ceux qui cherchent à échapper à la justice. Aujourd'hui, il n'existe plus de zone de non-droit où un criminel pourrait espérer s'évanouir indéfiniment. L'arrestation de Davis marque le triomphe de la méthode sur l'improvisation et de la rigueur sur l'audace criminelle. Ce résultat est une source d'espoir pour toutes les victimes dont les dossiers semblent piétinés, rappelant que l'engagement des enquêteurs ne se mesure pas à la durée de leur recherche, mais à la détermination de leur esprit. Chaque dossier, aussi froid ou ancien soit-il, possède en lui le potentiel d'être résolu si les moyens et la volonté sont réunis, confirmant la conviction que la justice est un processus capable de transcender les frontières pour exiger des comptes. Enfin, en terminant ce récit, nous rendons un dernier hommage à la mémoire de Shannon Davis. Son histoire est celle d'une vie interrompue, mais aussi d'une vérité qui, en dépit de tous les obstacles, a fini par prévaloir. Le souvenir de cette femme ne doit pas être défini par le crime dont elle fut victime, mais par la lumière qu'elle a laissée dans le cœur de ses proches, ceux-là même qui ont mené le combat pour elle. La justice n'est pas seulement une affaire de cellules et de verdicts, elle est un acte de reconnaissance envers la valeur intrinsèque de chaque existence. En clôturant ce dossier, nous affirmons que le crime ne peut jamais avoir le dernier mot. Si la noirceur de David Davis a marqué une période de notre histoire, la victoire finale de la vérité, portée par le courage et la science, demeure une leçon pérenne. Le mensonge peut, pendant un temps, tromper le monde, mais il ne peut jamais, dans l'absolu, s'imposer durablement contre la lumière de la réalité. La justice est, en dernier ressort, le garant de l'équilibre humain, et sa manifestation dans cette affaire restera gravée dans les annales comme un exemple éclatant que personne, aussi intelligent ou lointain soit-il, n'est jamais réellement hors de portée de ceux qui servent, avec patience et dévouement, les exigences de la loi et la dignité des victimes. Le dossier est clos, la vérité est établie, et le nom de Shannon Davis repose désormais dans la sérénité d'une justice rendue, assurant que son histoire servira, pour les générations futures, de rempart contre l'oubli et d'hommage à la force inébranlable de la vérité qui, tôt ou tard, finit toujours par faire trembler les fondations les plus robustes de la dissimulation criminelle. Au terme de cette exploration exhaustive, il nous incombe de méditer sur la résonance philosophique et éthique d'un tel dossier, qui transcende largement le cadre habituel des chroniques judiciaires pour toucher à l'essence même de la condition humaine confrontée au mal absolu. La trajectoire de David Davis, depuis ses prémices sombres dans le Michigan jusqu'à son arrestation retentissante dans le Pacifique Sud, constitue une parabole moderne sur l'inéluctabilité de la confrontation entre le mensonge structurel et la réalité factuelle. Nous avons observé comment un individu, armé d'une intelligence indéniable mais dépourvu de toute boussole morale, a tenté de se soustraire aux lois naturelles et civiles en se réinventant comme une entité nouvelle, effaçant son passé comme on effacerait une erreur de navigation. Pourtant, l'histoire nous enseigne avec une régularité implacable que le déni, si élaboré soit-il, finit toujours par se heurter à la solidité du réel. Chaque geste, chaque mensonge, chaque déplacement de Davis n'était qu'une brique ajoutée à un édifice dont la fragilité interne était condamnée à s'effondrer dès lors que la lumière de la vérité analytique viendrait à y pénétrer. C'est ici que réside la leçon primordiale de cette affaire. Le crime n'est jamais un acte isolé, il est une perturbation de l'ordre du monde qui appelle, par sa propre nature, une restauration de l'équilibre. La persistance de la justice, souvent perçue comme une entité abstraite, s'est incarnée ici dans la patience infinie des enquêteurs et dans le dévouement indéfectible des proches de Shannon Davis. Ces acteurs, dont le rôle est crucial, démontrent que la recherche de la vérité est un acte de résistance contre la tentation de l'oubli. Lorsque les institutions semblaient impuissantes ou égarées par les apparences, ce sont les liens humains, cette trame invisible mais indéfectible de l'affection et de la loyauté, qui ont maintenu l'exigence de justice. Cette réalité nous rappelle que les systèmes de sécurité et de droit, pour être efficaces, doivent toujours être alimentés par une conscience citoyenne éveillée. Sans cette pression constante, sans cette volonté de regarder au-delà du voile des explications superficielles, le crime aurait été définitivement classé dans les annales des tragédies inexpliquées. La victoire finale n'est donc pas seulement celle d'une agence fédérale contre un fugitif, c'est la victoire de la mémoire vivante contre l'effacement programmé. En examinant le vide laissé par la mort de Shannon, nous devons également réfléchir à la responsabilité collective que nous avons envers la dignité des victimes. Un récit de crime ne doit jamais se limiter à une dissection technique de la violence ou à une glorification, même involontaire, du génie maléfique du coupable. La véritable finalité de ce récit est de restaurer la figure de Shannon, de sortir son nom du cadre de l'accident pour le replacer dans celui d'une vie humaine injustement fauchée. Chaque détail forensique, chaque déposition, chaque élément de preuve présenté au tribunal avait pour vocation unique de dire qui elle était et de montrer que son absence n'était pas une fatalité naturelle, mais le produit d'une volonté prédatrice. C'est cette dimension humaniste qui transforme un dossier de police en une chronique historique. Elle nous force à reconnaître que derrière chaque dossier fermé, il y a une existence dont le sens a été nié et qu'il appartient à la justice, sous toutes ses formes, de rétablir cette valeur bafouée. Par ailleurs, la question du mal dans le cadre de la modernité technologique mérite une attention particulière. Davis a cru pouvoir utiliser le progrès scientifique, le développement des transports et l'ouverture des frontières à son avantage. Il voyait en la technologie un moyen de se libérer des contraintes du temps et de l'espace. Pourtant, il a tragiquement oublié que la technologie est une épée à double tranchant. Les outils même qui lui permettaient de voyager, de communiquer et de se cacher étaient ceux-là même qui allaient permettre de le tracer, de l'identifier et de le capturer. Il y a, dans cette ironie du sort, une forme de justice poétique. Le monde interconnecté qu'il pensait maîtriser est devenu le piège dans lequel il s'est enfermé. Cette constatation nous rassure sur le fait que, malgré les outils dont disposent les criminels pour dissimuler leurs traces, la transparence numérique et scientifique est un allié précieux pour la préservation de l'ordre social et la protection des individus. La réflexion sur ce dossier nous conduit également à questionner le rôle de nos propres mécanismes de perception. Pourquoi a-t-il fallu autant de temps pour identifier le prédateur derrière l'aviateur? C'est parce que nous avons un besoin psychologique vital de croire en la fiabilité de nos structures sociales. Nous voulons croire que les uniformes garantissent la rectitude, que les titres assurent l'intégrité et que la normalité est un indicateur de moralité. L'affaire Davis est une déchirure dans cette illusion rassurante. Elle nous confronte à la réalité troublante que l'apparence est un outil que les individus les plus dangereux manient avec une habileté déconcertante. Cette leçon de prudence ne doit pas conduire au cynisme, mais à une approche plus mesurée et analytique des relations humaines, particulièrement dans les contextes où des enjeux de confiance sont en jeu. La vigilance est le prix de la sécurité, non pas dans le sens d'une méfiance généralisée, mais dans celui d'une lucidité qui sait que l'image projetée ne reflète pas toujours la réalité interne. Le cadre géographique de cette affaire, des plaines du Midwest aux archipels isolés du Pacifique, souligne également la nature universelle de la justice. Elle ne connaît pas de frontières et ne s'arrête pas devant les obstacles climatiques ou culturels. Qu'il soit à Hillsdale ou au Samoa, le criminel reste un sujet de l'histoire, un être dont les actes sont inscrits dans une chronologie qui ne permet aucune parenthèse. La fuite de Davis n'était qu'un prolongement géographique de son déni psychologique. Le fait qu'il ait pu, pendant un temps, se fondre dans une culture aussi différente de la sienne prouve son adaptabilité prédatrice, mais cela prouve aussi qu'il n'existe aucun refuge contre soi-même. On peut changer de décor, changer de nom, changer de vie, on ne peut pas changer la nature de ce que l'on a commis. Cette vérité, bien que simple, est celle qui finit par briser toutes les résistances. Elle est le socle sur lequel repose toute la jurisprudence et toute notre vision du monde, celle selon laquelle chaque acte appelle une réponse et chaque injustice demande une réparation. En conclusion, la lecture de cette chronique criminelle nous laisse sur une note de solennité. Le rideau est tombé sur l'histoire de David Davis, mais les leçons qu'elle nous lègue sont appelées à perdurer. Nous avons parcouru les étapes d'une déchéance programmée, assisté à l'effondrement d'un ego surdimensionné et surtout, été témoin de la victoire de la persévérance sur l'imposture. Shannon Davis, par-delà le silence de sa tombe, a obtenu ce qu'elle méritait, la reconnaissance de la vérité. Le verdict rendu en 1987 n'a pas seulement condamné un homme à la privation de liberté, il a libéré la mémoire d'une femme de l'étreinte du mensonge. C'est là le véritable triomphe de la justice humaine. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de punir, il s'agit d'ordonner le chaos, de restaurer les faits et de garantir que, dans la mesure du possible, l'équilibre soit rétabli. Ce dossier restera, pour les générations futures, un témoignage éloquent de la force inaltérable de la vérité qui, malgré le temps, la distance et les efforts déployés pour l'ensevelir sous les couches de la dissimulation, finit toujours par faire surface, immuable et souveraine. Que cet hommage à la vérité serve de guide et de rappel que rien, absolument rien, n'est supérieur à la lumière des faits, et que la justice, dans sa patience tranquille et son obstination sans faille, demeure le rempart le plus solide contre la persistance de l'ombre. David Davis, autrefois maître de son destin fictif, n'est plus aujourd'hui qu'une ombre dans l'histoire, tandis que la vérité de son crime, elle, brille avec la clarté d'une évidence que plus rien ne pourra désormais jamais contester ni effacer. L'épilogue de cette affaire, au-delà de la clôture définitive des dossiers judiciaires et de l'incarcération pérenne de David Davis, nous convie à une introspection finale sur la nature de la mémoire collective et le rôle crucial que jouent les récits criminels dans la structuration de notre conscience éthique. Lorsque nous retraçons l'intégralité du parcours, depuis la quiétude pastorale du Michigan jusqu'à la confrontation brutale au Samoa, nous sommes saisis par la certitude que la justice n'est pas une simple réponse administrative à une infraction, mais un impératif de réparation qui survit à l'effacement volontaire du coupable. La figure de Davis, loin de représenter un génie du mal, s'impose désormais comme le symbole d'une vanité démesurée, celle d'un homme ayant cru que son intellect, couplé à une capacité de mutation permanente, pourrait suffire à corrompre la trame objective des faits. Cette ultime réflexion nous oblige à reconnaître que la vérité n'est pas seulement un état de fait, mais un processus dynamique exigeant, dont la préservation est le travail constant de la société contre la tentation de l'oubli. L'analyse de ces années de fuite, durant lesquelles Davies s'est efforcé de reconstruire une existence factice sur les cendres de sa moralité, révèle une dimension psychologique rarement explorée dans les annales judiciaires, celle de la prison intérieure. En se créant une nouvelle identité au Samoa, Davies ne s'est pas libéré des conséquences de ses actes, il a au contraire consolidé sa propre captivité. Chaque interaction sociale, chaque projet professionnel au sein de sa compagnie d'aviation, chaque geste envers sa nouvelle famille était imprégné de la nécessité vitale de maintenir le masque. Ce processus d'auto-aliénation, où l'individu doit quotidiennement nier une partie de lui-même pour survivre socialement, constitue un châtiment en soi, bien avant que la justice formelle ne vienne sceller son sort. C'est ici que réside la leçon la plus profonde de cet exil prolongé. Aucun horizon, aussi lointain soit-il, ne permet de fuir la réalité d'un acte de violence, car le criminel emporte toujours avec lui le poids de sa propre faute, condamné à vivre dans un monde où chaque souffle est une lutte pour maintenir l'illusion du néant. En nous tournant vers la victime, Shannon Davies, nous devons réaffirmer la nécessité de placer sa mémoire au centre du récit, contre toute tentation de focaliser notre attention sur la sophistication du tueur. La dignité de Shannon n'a pas été protégée par la loi au moment de sa mort, mais elle a été honorée par la détermination de ceux qui n'ont jamais cessé de chercher la vérité. Cette quête de justice est, en elle-même, un acte d'amour et de respect qui redonne à la victime la place qui lui est due dans l'histoire, la faisant passer du statut d'objet manipulé par un prédateur à celui de femme dont la vie, bien qu'injustement interrompue, reste le point focal de la mobilisation collective. Le récit de cette affaire est, en dernière analyse, un hommage à cette persévérance qui, dans l'obscurité, a su maintenir la lampe allumée jusqu'à ce que les faits soient enfin révélés. C'est cette résilience qui constitue la véritable réponse de la société face à la violence gratuite, une réponse qui ne se contente pas de punir, mais qui restaure la valeur de l'être humain bafoué. La dimension philosophique de cette affaire nous amène également à questionner le rôle du doute dans nos perceptions quotidiennes. Pourquoi, pendant si longtemps, le crime de Davies a-t-il été perçu comme une fatalité? C'est parce que le doute est une arme que les manipulateurs utilisent pour paralyser la raison des autres. En instillant l'idée de l'accident équestre, Davies a su exploiter une vulnérabilité psychologique commune, la peur de voir la réalité telle qu'elle est. Nous préférons, souvent, nous réfugier dans des explications tragiques mais conformes à nos attentes plutôt que de faire face à la brutalité inattendue d'un proche. Cette affaire nous enseigne la prudence intellectuelle, la nécessité de remettre en question les narratives les plus lisses, celles qui semblent trop cohérentes pour être honnêtes. Il existe un danger inhérent à la complaisance, et la justice, dans sa forme la plus pure, exige de nous un examen constant des certitudes que nous tenons pour acquises. En observant les traces laissées par ce dossier, nous constatons que la justice, bien qu'elle puisse sembler lointaine ou indifférente, est l'outil indispensable par lequel une société définit ses limites et protège ses membres. Le verdict de 1987 n'a pas seulement été une sentence pour Davies, il a été une affirmation des valeurs fondamentales de notre ordre juridique, le droit à la vie, le droit à la vérité et l'exigence de rendre des comptes. Sans cette perspective, la société sombrerait dans le chaos moral où les actes de violence resteraient sans suite. L'affaire Davies rappelle que le système, avec toutes ses faiblesses, est capable de se redresser et de corriger ses erreurs lorsque le travail de vérité est mené jusqu'au bout. C'est ce message d'espoir et de rigueur qui doit perdurer, faisant de cette histoire un socle sur lequel nous pouvons construire une confiance renouvelée en la capacité du droit à prévaloir sur la dissimulation. Le rideau tombe donc définitivement sur cette chronique, laissant derrière lui une leçon gravée dans les annales criminelles. David Davies, cet aviateur ayant cru pouvoir naviguer au-dessus des règles humaines, n'est plus qu'une étude de cas dans les manuels de criminologie et de psychologie judiciaire. Son histoire n'est pas celle d'une victoire, mais celle d'un échec total et absolu. Toutes ses stratégies, tous ses masques et tous ses voyages n'ont fait qu'allonger le temps de sa propre chute, rendant cette dernière plus spectaculaire et plus révélatrice de la vanité humaine. La vérité de Shannon Davies, portée par le courage de son entourage et la précision des experts, a fini par s'imposer comme l'unique réalité restante. Cette affaire démontre que, quelles que soient les apparences, le mensonge ne constitue jamais une base solide pour une existence. Tôt ou tard, la réalité rappelle ses droits et le criminel se retrouve seul face à la nudité de ses actes. Nous quittons ce récit avec le sentiment que la paix a enfin été rendue. Les années de fuite, la peur, le masque, le tribunal et l'enfermement constituent la trajectoire complète d'un acte qui a commencé par la trahison et s'est terminé par la reddition face à la réalité. Shannon, dont la vie a été le prix d'un calcul froid, se voit désormais honorée non seulement par la loi, mais par la mémoire de ceux qui ont refusé de laisser son nom disparaître dans l'oubli. La justice a rempli sa mission, et ce faisant, elle a réaffirmé sa place centrale comme garant de la dignité humaine. Il n'y a plus de mystère, plus de fuite, plus de secret, seulement la clarté d'un fait accompli qui, loin de susciter l'admiration, provoque chez l'observateur un sentiment de gravité face à l'immensité du dommage causé. Que cette affaire serve de rempart contre la noirceur et d'exemple de la force de la vérité. Le dossier est désormais scellé, laissant à l'histoire la responsabilité de se souvenir que derrière chaque crime, il y a une vie, et que derrière chaque évitement, il y a une justice qui, avec une patience infinie, finit toujours par se frayer un chemin jusqu'à la lumière. C'est en cela que réside la noblesse de notre système judiciaire, une noblesse qui triomphe de toutes les impostures, assurant que, quelle que soit la durée de l'ombre, la lumière finit par retrouver son trône, révélant la vérité telle qu'elle est, simple, implacable et définitive.